Dirt in his mouth, cold, wet earth against his cheek, a gray sky overhead. Ethan opened his eyes and didn't recognize his own hands or his own body. His fingers were thin and dirty. His wrists were thin. His ribs jutted out beneath his torn shirt. He sat up and felt two lives collide inside his head. One belonged to a grown man who knew about crop rotation and soil acidity. The other belonged to a 16-year-old boy who, an hour ago, had been thrown from a wagon into the mud. Both lives were his, and both were in pain. The wagon had already driven off. The last thing he'd heard from the guard was a simple parting remark. The guard had said that Ethan should die quietly, and for once in his life, do something right. The field stretched out all around him, vast, all the way to the horizon, gray-brown like cooled ashes, the dead land of the Ashton clan. Nothing had grown here for 500 years. Not a single mage, peasant, or noble had been able to pull even a weed from this soil. Everyone in the kingdom of Veldaria knew that this land was cursed. Everyone except Ethan. He bent down, scooped up a handful of dirt, rubbed it between his fingers, brought it to his nose and inhaled. Then he licked the tip of his finger and laughed. Quietly at first, then louder. His laughter turned into a cough that shook his ribs. Those idiots. Those pompous, rich idiots in their ridiculous cloaks. They'd cast him out onto the land they'd considered cursed for 500 years. But it wasn't a curse. It was soil acidification plus a nitrogen deficiency plus, judging by the color, an excess of iron. In Ethan's head were 12 protocols for restoring acidic soils. Half of them could be carried out without a single bag of fertilizer. Lime, clover, 3 seasons. It's treatable. And then a sound rang out in his head. Quiet, like a cracked bell. Translucent lines hung before his eyes. The Heartwood Settlement Development System has been activated. The core is 87% damaged. 1 resident detected. Mission: do not die before dawn. Reward: 10 settlement points. Ethan blinked. The lines didn't disappear. He rubbed his eyes with his dirty fist. The lines remained. He looked up at the gray sky. He looked at his own unfamiliar hands. He looked at the barren field, one he already knew how to heal. Then he said one word aloud. "All right." He got to his feet. His knees were shaking. His body weighed 15 pounds less than normal. His elbow was scraped down to the flesh. His clothes were rags that not even a beggar would have picked up off the road. But his mind was working, and in his mind lay something that no other person in this world possessed. Knowledge. Not magical, not divine. Ordinary earthly knowledge of an agronomist with 2 degrees and 7 years of experience. The lines in the air flickered and added a new entry. The first inhabitant claimed the land as his own, plus 10 settlement points, unlocked. Soil analysis, level 1. Ethan snorted. The system was giving him access to what he already knew. It was as if someone had locked his own memory in a chest and was now solemnly handing him the keys one by one. Fine. So be it. He looked around. The field stretched out in every direction. Not a tree, not a bush, not a stream. Only far to the west did some kind of structure loom in the twilight, either a hut or a shed. The sun was already setting. The temperature was dropping. Without a fire or shelter, the night on this barren land could kill him faster than any guard. Ethan headed toward the shack. Every step was a struggle. His body was weak and hungry. But inside that body sat a man who had spent 7 years pulling an Iowa farm out of bankruptcy. A man who knew that the land doesn't lie. Only the people who trade in it do. The cabin turned out to be closer than he thought. Stone walls, a roof of rotten straw. The door hung by a single hinge. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dampness. Ethan stepped over the threshold and heard a sound. A quiet, raspy cough. Someone was lying in the corner on a pile of rags. He moved closer. An old woman, 60 or 70 years old. Her face was gray. Her lips were chapped. Her forehead was hot. A fever. Ethan knelt down beside her. She opened her clouded eyes and looked at him. She tried to say something, but no sound came out, just a rasp. Ethan placed his hand on her forehead. She was burning up. Without help, she wouldn't survive the night. He had no medicine, no food, no fire. Nothing but his knowledge and stubbornness. He stood up and went outside. The last light of day was still clinging to the horizon. Ethan walked along the wall of the hut, watching his step carefully. Everyone thought nothing grew on dead ground. Everyone was wrong. In a crack between the stones, he found yarrow, tough and dry, but alive. A little further on, at the base of the wall, plantain was growing, 3 leaves. That would be enough. 20 steps further on, he stumbled upon some wild onions. Thin shoots were poking out of a crack in the foundation. Ethan gathered everything. He returned to the hut. Now he needed fire. He examined the walls. Stone, ordinary gray stone. But in one spot, a piece of flint was embedded in the masonry. Ethan pried it out with his fingernails, scraping the skin off his fingers. He found a second piece by the threshold. He gathered dry straw from the roof. He sat down on the floor and began striking sparks. It didn't work the first time, or the second, or the 10th. His hands were shaking from the cold and weakness. But on the 20th try, the straw caught fire, a tiny flame. Ethan blew on it gently, as if it were a newborn. The flame grew. He added more straw. Then he found a cracked clay shard in the corner of the hut. He went out to the nearest puddle. He scooped up some water. He placed the shard over the fire. While the water was heating up, he ground yarrow between stones. He tore plantain into small pieces. He chopped wild onions with his fingernail. When the water came to a boil, he threw everything into the shard. He waited. He stirred it with a stick. He took it off the fire. He let it cool to a drinkable temperature. Then he lifted the old woman's head and brought the decoction to her lips. She couldn't swallow. He poured it drop by drop. 1 drop, 2, 3. She coughed. He waited. Another drop. An hour passed like this. 2, 5. The night dragged on endlessly. The cold seeped to the bone. He had to stoke the fire every 20 minutes. Ethan didn't sleep. He sat next to the old woman and fed her from the shard. By midnight, she began to shiver. Then she began to sweat. Then she shivered again. Ethan took off his shirt and draped it over her shoulders. He was left in just his pants. His teeth were chattering. But he kept giving her the broth, drop by drop, hour by hour. Toward morning, when a gray light began to seep through the holes in the roof, the old woman stopped shivering. Her forehead grew cooler. Her breathing evened. The fever subsided. She opened her eyes. This time, her gaze was clear. She looked at Ethan, at the skinny, half-naked boy with dark circles under his eyes who hadn't slept all night and had been holding her hand. She asked who he was. Ethan said his name was Ethan and that he lived here now. She asked if he was a saint. Ethan laughed hoarsely. New lines flashed before her eyes. Plus 50 settlement points. Resident of Mabel. Trust 47 out of 100. Unlocked. Herbalism level 1. Unlocked. First role. Settlement healer. Saint. He simply remembered that plantain lowers a fever. In his world, every 6-year-old knew that. Mabel Thorne. That was her name. 68 years old. A former midwife. A former servant of the former owner of these lands. She'd stayed here because she had nowhere else to go. 20 years ago, she'd lost her son in the war against the goblins. Ever since, she'd been afraid to go to anyone. And now she lay on a pile of rags, staring at the boy who had just pulled her back from the brink of death with a decoction made from weeds. Ethan sat down beside her and leaned his back against the cold wall. He closed his eyes for a second. His body was aching with exhaustion, but there was something strange in his chest, something warm. He had saved a person, the first person in his new life, and the system had given him 50 points for it. Not for killing a monster, Not for winning a battle, for a cup of weed tea and a sleepless night. Ethan opened his eyes and looked at Mabel. She had already dozed off again. Her breathing was steady. Her cheeks were slightly flushed. He looked out the window at the barren field stretching to the horizon. Then he looked at his hands. Dirty, scraped, alien, but capable. He said quietly, addressing neither Mabel nor the system, but the earth itself. "Well, hello. My name is Ethan, and I'm going to heal you." The morning began with hunger. Ethan hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. The teenager's body was demanding food, and demanding it loudly. His stomach was cramping so badly that it was hard to stand up straight. But he had to stand. Mabel woke up and immediately tried to get up. Ethan sat her back down. He told her she needed to lie down for at least another day. She looked at him with the kind of gaze old women use when looking at stubborn boys. Then she said there was an old sack of dried turnips in the cellar under the hut. From last year. Maybe even the year before that. Ethan found the cellar, or rather a pit beneath a stone slab. There really was a sack lying in the pit. The turnips were hard as wood, but edible. He sliced them into thin strips and boiled them in the same shard of pottery. The result was something between soup and warm water with a hint of flavor. But it was food. Mabel ate greedily. Ethan forced himself to eat slowly, to make it last. Once his stomach had received at least something, his mind began to work more clearly. Ethan stepped out of the hut and surveyed his domain in daylight for the first time. The field stretched out in all 4 directions. To the north, mountains loomed dark on the distant horizon, the Ash Range. To the south, the field gave way to a gentle hill, beyond which a road could be made out. To the west stood the ruins of 3 or 4 more buildings. To the east, nothing but emptiness. 800 square miles of dead land. And he was alone. With just 1 old woman and 60 settlement points. Ethan crouched down and scooped up another handful of soil. Soil Analysis Level 1 helpfully highlighted what he already knew. High acidity, nitrogen nearly at 0, an excess of iron, no organic matter. But the soil structure wasn't destroyed. Deeper than half a meter, the soil was alive. It had simply suffocated. 500 years without proper care, without crop rotation, no compost, no clover to fix nitrogen from the air. In his world, this was basic first-year knowledge. Here, no one had ever heard of it. Ethan stood up and walked toward the ruins to the west. The first structure turned out to be a former barn. The roof had collapsed. The walls were still standing. Inside, he found a broken shovel. The handle was cracked, but the blade was intact. He found a long stick among the roof debris. He tied the blade to it with a scrap of rope. It was crooked, but it worked. The second structure had once been a barn. It was empty, but in the corner lay a pile of old, dried-out manure. Ethan looked at the pile and smiled. To any resident of Veldaria, it was just dirt. To an agronomist from Iowa, it was gold. Manure plus straw plus ash equals compost. Compost equals nitrogen. Nitrogen equals life. The third building was completely destroyed, but next to it, the edge of a stone slab jutted out of the ground. Ethan dug around it with a broken shovel. Under the slab was an old well, dry, but water glistened at the bottom. Deep, about 5 meters, but there was water. Ethan sat on the edge of the well and took stock. There's water, there's manure, there's ash from the fire, there's straw from the roof, there's a shovel. The soil is ready to be restored. He needed clover seeds. Wild clover must grow somewhere in the vicinity. If the soil was acidified, then clover could only survive at the edge of the dead zone, where the soil is slightly better. Ethan stood and headed south toward the road, toward the edge of the dead field. He walked for 2 hours. His body protested with every step. His knees buckled. His vision grew dark. But he kept walking. At the edge of the field, where the gray earth gave way to the usual brown, he found what he was looking for: clover. Wild red clover. A small scattering of pink blossoms among the rocks. Ethan dropped to his knees before this clover as if before an altar. He gathered the seeds, carefully, one by one. He poured them into his shirt pocket. He gathered as many as he could find. Then he stood up and headed back to the cabin, back to Mabel, back to his barren land, which he intended to bring back to life. When he returned, Mabel was sitting at the cabin door, basking in the faint sunlight. She looked at him and asked where he'd been. Ethan showed her a handful of seeds. He told her they were clover. Mabel raised her eyebrows. She said that clover was a weed, and that in her 68 years of life, she had never once seen anyone rejoice over a weed as if it were a sack of gold. Ethan sat down next to her and explained, simply, as he would explain it to a child. Clover takes from the air what is missing from the soil. It heals the soil. If you plant clover in a barren field, after one growing season, the soil will be able to support wheat. Mabel listened in silence. Then she asked how he knew that. Ethan paused. He said that in a distant village across the sea, that's what they taught him. Mabel shook her head. She said that over the past 500 years, magicians, scientists, and priests had come here over the past 500 years, and no one had been able to do anything. And he wanted to heal the land with a weed. Ethan nodded. He said that was exactly what he wanted to do. Mabel looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was either a saint or a madman, and that in either case he needed lunch. She got up and went into the hut to cook a turnip. Ethan set to work. First, the compost. He hauled manure from the old barn to the cabin. He gathered ashes from the fire. He gathered dry straw from the roofs of the ruins. He mixed it all together in a pit he dug with a shovel behind the cabin. Manure, straw, ashes, water from the well, the right layers, the right proportions. He'd done this hundreds of times in his past life. His hands remembered, even if they were someone else's. When the first compost pile was set up, a bell rang in his head again. Plus 15 settlement points. Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead. Then he marked out a plot of land in front of the hut. 10 steps by 10 steps. A small square. He dug it up with a shovel. The soil was hard to work, hard as a rock. But beneath the top layer it was softer, alive, sleeping. He took clover seeds out of his pocket and began to sow them, carefully, evenly, just as he'd been taught. He watered it with water from the well. He stepped back and looked at his first plot. 10 steps by 10 steps, wet, gray earth. Not a single green sprout. Not yet. Rose flashed in the air, plus 20 settlement points. The first field has been sown. Total score, 95 points. Ethan looked at the numbers and grunted. 95 points. He needed 1,000 to unlock the windmill blueprint. 500 for a well with a pump. 300 for a decent plow. A long road ahead. But he'd started. That evening, he and Mabel sat by the campfire in front of the cabin. Mabel was boiling the last turnip. Ethan was looking at the stars. In this world, they were different. Brighter, bigger, closer. Mabel asked what he planned to do next. Ethan said that in 90 days, a royal official would arrive to collect taxes. If the land hadn't yielded anything by then, they'd take it away, and Ethan would be sent to the mines. Mabel fell silent. Then she said quietly that people in the mines lived an average of 4 months. Ethan nodded. He said he knew. That's why they had no room for error. Mabel looked at his planted patch. 10 steps by 10 steps of wet gray earth. And she asked if he really believed anything would grow from that. Ethan replied that he didn't believe it. He knew. Those were two different things. Mabel shook her head and said he was definitely crazy, but the turnips had given him a boost. That night, when Mabel fell asleep, Ethan lay on the floor of the hut and stared at the ceiling. The system hummed quietly at the edge of his consciousness. The influence map showed a tiny circle around the hut. 2 living beings inside, him and Mabel. Beyond the circle's boundaries lay darkness. He closed his eyes. In 88 days, he was due to pay taxes on land where nothing had grown for 500 years. He had a broken shovel, one old woman, a handful of clover seeds, and a head full of knowledge from a world that didn't exist here. Somewhere in Ravenhall, his father, Baron Hartwood, was pouring himself some wine and waiting for the problem named Ethan to resolve itself in 3 months' time. Ethan clenched his fists in the darkness. Then he unclenched them. Then he said quietly to himself, 88 days. That'll be enough. On the 7th day, the system ran the lottery. Ethan woke up to the ringing of a bell in his head. Something like a wheel appeared before his eyes, translucent, with symbols he couldn't read. The wheel spun for 3 seconds and stopped. A blueprint appeared. Compost pit, level 1. Ethan stared at the lines. Compost pit. He'd already set up 3 compost piles this week, with his own 2 hands, without any blueprints. The system had given him instructions for something he already knew how to do. He laughed so loudly that Mabel peeked out of the cabin and asked if he'd lost his mind. Ethan told her that fate had just given him a recipe for dirt. Mabel replied that fate apparently knew him better than he thought. But the blueprint wasn't entirely useless. When Ethan read it carefully, he saw the difference. His earthly compost piles were working, but the system's blueprint added something new to the process. Compost prepared according to the blueprint matured twice as fast, not 60 days, but 30. That changed everything. Ethan rebuilt all 3 piles according to the new plan. His hands had already grown accustomed to the shovel. The calluses on his palms had thickened. His body was still thin and weak, but it had begun to work, like an old engine that coughs but keeps going. By the 10th day, what he'd been waiting for happened. The first sprout. Green, bright, incredibly bright against the backdrop of the gray, dead earth. A clover had broken through. Ethan stood over that sprout and stared at it for 5 minutes without moving. Mabel walked over and stood beside him. She stared at it too. Then she said quietly that there hadn't been anything green on this land for 500 years. Ethan said nothing. A lump formed in his throat. It was silly. It was just clover, just a weed. But it had broken through. After 500 years of dead earth, it had broken through. Lines in the air, plus 30 settlement points. First harvest on dead land. Achievement unlocked. Founder's lottery. Bonus roll. The wheels spun again. This time a windmill came up. A complete blueprint. Materials, dimensions, mechanism. Ethan read the blueprint and whistled. The mill was simple. A wooden structure with stone millstones. He could build it in 2 weeks if he had hands. The problem was that he didn't have any hands, only his own, and Mabel, who was 68 and couldn't lift a log. He set the windmill blueprint aside. Later. Right now there were more important things to do. Every day Ethan expanded the area he was planting. 10 by 10 turned into 20 by 20, then to 30 by 30. He dug up the soil from morning until dark. Mabel cooked. Food was scarce. The turnips ran out on the 5th day. Ethan found wild sorrel and burdock roots in the surrounding area. He gathered edible herbs. He set snares for small game made of rope that he'd woven from straw. On the 8th day, a rabbit got caught in the snare. Mabel made soup out of it, which they stretched out over 3 days. Ethan pulled a bucket of water from the well using a rope and a shard of pottery and found that the water was clear, cold, delicious. The well was working, plus 15 settlement points. The days passed. The clover grew. Slowly, but it grew. The green patch in the gray field expanded. Ethan looked at it every morning and every evening. He counted the sprouts. He checked the soil. He touched the leaves. He talked to the clover out loud, and Mabel stopped paying any attention to it. On the 15th day, he began the second phase, liming. Lime was needed to lower the soil's acidity. In his world, he used to buy it by the bag. Here, there were no bags. But there were stones, a specific type of stone that, when burned, produces lime. Ethan found them in the ruins of the 3rd building, ordinary limestone. He dug a pit for burning. He lit a fire. He burned the stones all day. He ended up with a handful of lime. Not much, but it was enough for the first section. He scattered it across the field. He poured water on it. The ground sizzled. Mabel jumped back and asked if he'd poisoned the field. Ethan said that it was normal. The soil was waking up. On the 18th day, Mabel spoke of his brother for the first time. She said that Damon would be coming. Soon. He always comes to check if something's going wrong, or if something's going too well. Ethan asked what she knew about Damon. Mabel replied that Damon was a petty, spiteful little bastard with 2 stars in his dad's wallet, that he'd been here twice in the last 5 years. The first time he burned down the old barn just for fun. The second time he kicked her dog so hard that it ran away and never came back. Ethan listened in silence, his hands clenched on their own. There were 2 people inside him, and both hated Damon. The adult agronomist hated him with a cold, calculated hatred. The 16-year-old boy hated him with every fiber of his being. Damon took his food away every day. Damon broke his finger when Ethan was 12. Damon told his father that Ethan had stolen a silver spoon, and his father whipped Ethan with a belt in front of the servants. Damon sold the spoon himself. Ethan exhaled. He unclenched his fists. Anger wouldn't help. Preparation would. He asked Mabel if there was anything valuable here, something Damon didn't know about. Mabel thought for a moment. Then she said there was a chest in the basement beneath the ruined house to the west. She hadn't been able to open it, it was too heavy. Ethan went to the ruins. He found the basement beneath a stone slab and climbed down. The chest was still there, wooden, bound with iron. The lock was rusted shut. Ethan broke it open with a rock. Inside were documents, old, yellowed scrolls. Ethan couldn't read all of them, but he understood one right away. It was a land deed, the original, bearing a century-old royal seal. The Hartwood estate wasn't registered to the Ashton clan, as everyone had thought. It was registered to the Hartwood family, a long time ago, long before she was declared dead. His father knew about this. His father had transferred the estate to Ethan not simply to get rid of his son. He'd done so because the estate already belonged to the Hartwoods. And if Ethan dies without an heir, the land will revert to the Baron, to his father, who had already agreed to sell it to Count Valancourt. Ethan sat down on the cellar floor and stared at the deed for a long time. Then he carefully rolled it up and tucked it into his shirt. It was a weapon, not a sword, not magic, but paper. But in a world where the law was defined by seals, paper was mightier than the sword. He returned to Mabel. He told her he'd found something important. Mabel looked at his face and didn't ask any questions. She simply poured him some soup. On the 20th day, dust rose from the south. 4 horses, 4 riders, and one riding ahead on a chestnut stallion that Ethan would have recognized among 1,000. Damon Hartwood, his older brother. 18 years old, 2 stars of awakening, broad shoulders, his father's chin, and that very same smirk Ethan saw every time Damon hurt him. Riding alongside him were 4 buddies, sons of small merchants from Ravenhall, not nobles, but well off. The very ones who had laughed the loudest when Ethan was thrown into the wagon. Ethan stood by his hut and watched them approach. His hands weren't shaking. He'd made them stop shaking. Mabel stood behind him in the doorway. She was silent, but Ethan could hear her quietly pulling a heavy cauldron from the corner. Damon stopped his horse 20 paces away. He dismounted. He looked around. His gaze swept over the repaired cabin, over the compost piles, over the cleared yard, over the well with its new rope. His grin widened. "Well, well," he said, "the rat's still alive." His buddies laughed. Damon walked across the yard as if it were his own territory. He kicked the bucket by the well. He nudged the edge of the compost pile with his foot. He winced at the smell. He asked what that crap was. Ethan said it was compost. Damon asked what compost was. Ethan said that in 30 days it would be worth more than the horse Damon had ridden in on. Damon stopped smiling. He looked at Ethan, intently. Something had changed in his younger brother, and Damon could sense it. His voice was different. His gaze was different. The boy who always used to look down was now looking straight ahead. Damon stepped closer. He said that Ethan had become bold. Probably the dead earth had gone to his head. Then he turned to his friends and said that they had come to look at a corpse, but found a clown playing in the mud. His friends laughed again. One of them walked over to the compost pile and spat into it. Ethan said nothing. Damon walked another circle around the yard. He noticed a cleared patch of ground. He stopped. He squinted. He stepped closer and froze. A green patch. Clover. Bright, vibrant green clover on ground that had been dead for 500 years. Damon stood there staring at the clover, and Ethan saw the blood drain from his face. The friends came over and saw it too. One of them crossed himself. Another took a step back. Damon turned to Ethan. He asked, "How?" Ethan shook his head. He said he'd planted it and watered it. Damon said that was impossible. Nothing had grown here for 500 years. Mages had come. Priests had prayed. Nothing. And here, a worthless kid with 0 stars had stuck a weed in the ground, and it had grown. Ethan looked at his brother in silence. Damon was starting to get angry. His face flushed. He asked what kind of magic Ethan was using. Ethan replied that he wasn't using any. Damon said that was a lie, that a blank couldn't do anything, that someone was behind him, a mage, a demon, or some other creature. Ethan shrugged again. He waited. He knew his brother. He knew that Damon's anger always turned into action, quickly and recklessly. Damon didn't disappoint. He snatched a torch from his friend. Flint, a strike, a spark, fire, and he headed for the clover field. Ethan didn't budge. He said one sentence. He said that Damon was about to burn 2,000 gold pieces. Damon stopped. Not because he believed it, because the amount was too specific. 2,000 gold pieces is their father's annual income. Ethan explained calmly. Clover restores the soil. Restored soil yields wheat. Wheat can be sold. 10 acres of restored land yield a harvest worth 500 gold pieces per season. 4 fields equal 2,000 per year, every year, from land that everyone useless. Damon listened with his mouth agape. So did his friends. Numbers were a language they understood. But then Damon shook his head. The smirk returned. He said it didn't matter how much it cost. In 70 days, the land would be confiscated anyway. Ethan wouldn't pay the tax, and then the land would go back to their father. And his father had already made a deal with Count Valancourt. Ethan nodded. He said he knew, because he'd read the letter. Damon froze. He asked what letter. Ethan turned to Mabel. Mabel stepped forward and pulled a folded sheet of paper from her apron pocket. She'd taken it from Damon's cloak while he was walking around the courtyard. Damon reached into his pocket. It was empty. His face went pale. Ethan took the letter and unfolded it. It was correspondence between Baron Hartwood and Count Valancourt. 3 letters. In the first, his father offered to give up the land in exchange for the cancellation of a debt of 800 gold pieces. In the second, the Count agreed but demanded that Ethan be officially disinherited. In the third, his father replied that this would be done through the land registry. Ethan spoke of this, and Damon recoiled as if struck. The friends were silent. They weren't buying into this. A conspiracy with the Count was no joke. If the royal court found out that the Baron was secretly selling land in circumvention of the land registry law, it would mean the loss of the title, for all the Hartwoods, including Damon. Ethan folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt front. Calmly, he told Damon that he had 2 options. First, leave and forget about it. Second, continue, and then Ethan would send a copy of the letter to the royal inspector. Damon stood motionless. The torch in his hand was burning out. The flame licked at his fingers, but he didn't notice. Then he threw the torch to the ground and stomped it out. He turned toward his horse. One of his friends tried to say something. Damon snapped at him and the man fell silent. They mounted their horses. Damon looked at Ethan one last time. There was no anger in his eyes, only fear. He turned his horse around and rode off. Dust swirled up and settled. It grew quiet. Mabel walked over to Ethan. She said she'd had nimble fingers since she was young. Ethan looked at her. He asked when she'd had time to do it. Mabel shrugged. She said that while that fool was kicking the buckets, she'd been kicking his pockets. And she added that it was easier than it looked because Damon wears a coat a size too big. Ethan laughed. For the first time in 20 days, he laughed so hard he doubled over. Mabel watched him and smiled. Lines in the air. Resident Mabel. Trust 65 out of 100. Unlocked. Reconnaissance level 1. Ethan laughed it off. He straightened up. He looked south where Damon had galloped off. He said quietly, "Father knows I'm alive, and he's waiting for me to die in 60 days. Mabel put her hand on his shoulder. She said that in that case, they'd better not die. That evening, Ethan sat by the campfire and thought. The letter was a weapon, but a one-time use one. His father now knows that Ethan knows. He'll change his plan. He'll find another way. Ethan had 68 days until the census. He needed people, hands, workers. He and Mabel alone couldn't bring this land up to a level that would allow them to pay the tax. But who would come to work on a barren field for a kid with 0 stars? He lay there, staring at the ceiling. And then the system highlighted a new line. Task: accept the first volunteer resident. Reward: 25 settlement points and unlock the settlement beacon. The beacon. Ethan read the description. Settlement beacon. It sends a faint signal up to 3 miles away. People within its range feel an inexplicable sense of calm and a desire to head toward the settlement. Not coercion, not control, just a quiet voice saying that somewhere nearby, there's a place where you'll be fed. Ethan needed this lighthouse, but for that he needed a third resident, one who would come on their own, of their own free will. Ethan closed his eyes. 68 days. On the 28th day, Mabel made soup from nettles and wild garlic. Ethan sat across from her and ate in silence. Over the past week, he had quadrupled the area under cultivation. Clover already covered a plot 40 paces by 40. The compost piles had matured on an accelerated schedule, and Ethan laid the first layer of compost into the ground next to the clover. The soil was changing. He could see it every day. The gray color was fading. A russet hue appeared, then dark brown. The earth began to smell different, not like ash or stone, but like something alive. Mabel felt it too. She would go out barefoot into the field in the morning and stand there in silence. Then she'd come back and say that the earth was warm. It used to be as cold as a grave. Now it was warm. Ethan nodded. Warmth is good. Warmth means that microbiological processes have begun in the soil. The decomposition of organic matter, the release of heat, life. He explained this to Mabel in simple terms. Mabel listened and nodded and called him the boy who talks to the dirt. But there was no mockery in her voice, only surprise, and something like hope. On the evening of the 28th, Ethan was repairing the hut's roof. The old straw had rotted and was leaking in 3 places. He cut fresh grass at the edge of the field and laid it down in layers. The work went slowly. His hands ached. His back throbbed. But the roof was necessary. In 2 weeks, the rains would begin. He knew this because Mabel had said so. And Mabel knew because she'd lived here for 20 years and had learned to read the sky better than any weather mage. Ethan was standing on the roof when he saw movement on the southern road. Someone was walking, slowly, with an unsteady gait, stumbling. He climbed down from the roof and walked toward them. As the figure drew nearer, it became clearer. Short, dark hair, tattered and dirty clothes. Something heavy tied with a rope was strapped to their back. When the figure was about 50 steps away, Ethan saw that it was a girl. Young, maybe 19, maybe 20. She walked without looking up. Her left shoulder was wrapped in a blood-stained rag. Her right hand gripped the handle of whatever was hanging on her back. Ethan stepped closer and saw that she was carrying a hammer on her back, a blacksmith's hammer, huge. It probably weighed more than she did. The girl stopped 10 steps away from him. She raised her head. Her eyes were dark, alert, like those of a beast accustomed to being beaten by humans. On her left shoulder, beneath the rag, he could make out a brand, burned into her skin, a mark of ownership. Ethan had seen such marks in his memories of the Heartwood boys. That was how slaves were branded in the East. She was silent. He was silent. Mabel came out of the cabin and stopped behind Ethan. She looked at the girl. She looked at the hammer. She looked at the blood on her shoulder. Then she went back into the cabin. A minute later, she returned with a bowl of soup. She set it on the ground between them. She stepped back. The girl looked at the bowl, then at Ethan, then at Mabel, then back at the bowl. She dropped to her knees. She took the bowl in both hands and began to eat, with her hands, greedily, without looking up. Soup dripped down her chin. She didn't notice. When the bowl was empty, she set it on the ground. She looked at Ethan. She waited. For what? Ethan knew what. She was waiting for a price. Everyone who had ever fed her wanted something in return. Work, a favor, her body, something. No one feeds you for nothing. Ethan turned to Mabel. He said the second cabin to the west was still standing. The roof was full of holes, but the walls were sound. Mabel nodded. Ethan looked at the girl and said the cabin was available. If she wanted, she could stay. She could leave in the morning. She could leave right now. It was up to her. He turned and walked back to the roof he'd been repairing. He didn't look back. The girl sat on the ground, watching his back. Mabel walked over to her. She said, "Let's go." She pointed to the cabin. She brought some rags for a bed. She brought water. The girl lay down and fell asleep instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. She didn't let go of the hammer. She slept with it like a child with a toy. Mabel returned to Ethan and told him the girl had a brand. She said she was a runaway slave. Her master would send people after her for that. Ethan said he knew. Mabel asked what he was going to do. Ethan said nothing. She had come. She ate. She's sleeping. The rest in the morning. Mabel shook her head. She said he'd get himself into trouble. Ethan replied that he was already living on a cursed land with 0 stars and the threat of the mines in 62 days. Trouble had come a long time ago. Mabel snorted and went to sleep. The girl slept for 3 days. She woke up only to drink some water and then sank back into sleep. Ethan didn't disturb her. Mabel brought food and set it down beside her. The food disappeared. On the 4th day, Ethan was sitting on the threshold of his hut, sharpening the blade of his shovel with a stone. He heard footsteps. He turned around. The girl was standing in front of him. In her hands she held not a hammer, but a rusty fragment of a scythe that had been lying among the ruins. She held it out to Ethan, silently. Ethan looked at the fragment. He looked at the girl. He understood. She was offering work in exchange for food and shelter, the only currency she knew. Ethan shook his head. He stood up. He went into the hut. He returned with the rusty scythe he'd found in the ruins 3 days earlier. He set it down in front of her. He said he didn't need a sword. He needed a plow. He asked if she could make one. She looked at him for a long time, a full minute. Then she picked up the scythe. She examined the blade, ran her finger along the edge, and nodded. Lines appeared in the air. Plus 25 settlement points. 3rd resident accepted. Settlement beacon unlocked. Hidden talent discovered. Sun Min Han. Talent. Understanding of metal. Ethan read the talent description. Understanding of metal. An extremely rare talent, 1 star. But when it comes to working with metal, it's equivalent to 3. He can sense the structure of an alloy by touch. He can determine the composition of ore by the sound it makes when struck. He knows the melting point by the color of the flame. Ethan looked at Sun Min. She didn't know what he saw. To her, he was just a skinny boy who didn't ask questions and asked for a plow instead of a sword. Ethan asked her name. She answered with 1 word, Sun Min. Ethan nodded. He said his name was Ethan. He pointed to Mabel. He said this was Mabel. He pointed to the field of clover. He said that was future wheat. He pointed to the hut. He said that was a house. Her house, if she wanted to stay. Sun Min stood motionless. Then she sat down on the ground. She placed the broken scythe on her lap, and she began to work. Silently, without a word, without a nod. She just started working. Mabel walked over to Ethan. She said quietly that the girl wasn't talking. Ethan replied that she had just said more than some people say in a whole year. Mabel looked at him strangely. Then she nodded. On the 32nd day, Sun Min finished the plow. Ethan didn't know where she'd gotten the anvil. It turned out she'd found a flat stone of the right density and shaped it with a hammer. She'd fashioned the horn from stones and clay. She burned charcoal from the roots of an old stump she'd dug up at the edge of the field. She worked with metal the way Ethan worked with the earth. Quietly, precisely, with absolute understanding of what she was doing. The plow was beautiful. There was no other word for it. The blade was made from a reforged piece of a scythe. The handle was a sturdy branch. The fastenings were iron staples she had forged from rusty nails found in the ruins. Ethan took the plow. He went out into the field. He thrust the blade into the ground. He pulled. The plow glided through the barren earth as if on butter. The furrow it left behind was smooth and deep. The earth parted. It offered no resistance, as if it had been waiting. Ethan plowed one furrow, then a second, then a third. Mabel stood at the edge of the field and watched. Sun Min stood next to her and watched too. Ethan turned around. He saw them. Two women at the edge of the barren field, one old and wise, the other young and silent. Both looked at him with an expression he couldn't name. Then he understood. It was hope. Lines in the air, plus 80 settlement points. Level 1 smithy unlocked. Ethan stopped. He thrust the plow into the ground. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. He looked at the numbers. His total points had surpassed 250. 58 days remained until the census. He had land that was beginning to come to life. An old woman with nimble fingers, a blacksmith who turned trash into works of art. The first sprouts of hope, and a beacon that pulsed quietly within a 3-mile radius, promising everyone who heard it that somewhere nearby there was a place where they would be fed and not asked where they came from. In the evening, Ethan sat by the fire. Mabel was mending a shirt. Sun Min sat a little to the side, sharpening the blade of a hammer. Ethan caught himself thinking. In his past life, he'd spent 7 years pulling bankrupt farms out of debt. But he'd never felt what he was feeling now. He wasn't building a farm. He was building a home. For people no one wanted, on land everyone had abandoned, from nothing. Mabel looked up from her sewing. She asked what he was thinking about. Ethan said he was thinking that they needed more people. Mabel asked who would go work on barren land for a boy with no stars. Ethan looked at her, then at Sun Min. He said quietly, "Those who have nowhere else to go." Mabel fell silent. Sun Min looked up. Their eyes met for a second. Then Sun Min lowered her gaze back to the hammer. But Ethan noticed. The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. That night, Ethan checked the locks on the gate. There were no locks, no gate either. Just a gap between the stones where the gate used to stand. He thought of Sun Min, about the brand on her shoulder, about the master who would be looking for her, about how runaway slaves in Veldaria are caught and returned, and about how he, Ethan Hartwood, with 0 stars and a broken shovel, wouldn't be able to protect her if armed men came. Not yet, anyway. But the beacon was already working, a quiet pulse at the edge of knowledge, a 3-mile radius. Somewhere out there, beyond the dead zone's border, were people with nowhere to go, refugees, vagabonds, outcasts, those whom the kingdom had spat out like chaff. They would sense the beacon, and some of them would head toward its light. Ethan went to bed. 58 days until the census, 250 settlement points, 3 residents, 1 field of clover, one plow, and a quiet certainty that everything would work out. Not faith, certainty, based on numbers and knowledge and stubbornness. Before falling asleep, he heard Sun Min checking the locks that weren't there. She walked around the huts every night, checking, keeping watch, waiting for someone. Ethan knew who. Her former master would come, sooner or later. And by then, Ethan would have walls, and people behind those walls, and a reason for those people to stand their ground instead of running away. On the 34th day, the lighthouse brought the first ones. 2 men and a woman, dirty, hungry, with empty eyes. They emerged from the forest at the southern edge of the field and stopped. They looked at the huts, at the green patch of clover, at the smoke rising from the chimney. Ethan went out to meet them. He asked where they were from. The older of the 2 men said they were from the village of Craigmore. Bandits had burned their homes 3 days ago. They'd been walking north aimlessly, just walking. And then they sensed something, warmth, a sense of direction, as if someone had called out to them softly. Ethan nodded. The lighthouse was working. He didn't bother to explain. He said there was soup and a roof over their heads. If they wanted to stay, there would be work. If not, they could leave in the morning. They stayed. The men's names were Gareth and Thomas, brothers, former carpenters, 1 star each. The woman's name was Nora, Gareth's wife. She was pregnant, about 5 months along. Ethan looked at her belly and realized the situation had changed. Now he didn't just have a pair of working hands, he had a responsibility toward the unborn child. Lines in the air, plus 25 points for each, plus 75 in total, 6 residents, unlocked. Construction level 1. Ethan sat the brothers down by the campfire and told them what needed to be done. 2 huts to repair, 1 new one to build, deepen the well, a fence around the settlement. Gareth listened and nodded. He was a carpenter. He understood the work. He asked only one thing. "How will you pay us?" Ethan said he'd pay with food and a roof over their heads. No money. Not yet. Gareth looked at his wife, at her belly, then at Ethan. He said that would be enough. On the 35th day, Gareth and Thomas began building. Ethan showed them a blueprint from the system. A simple design. Stone walls, a wooden roof, a window, a door. The brothers looked at the blueprint and exchanged glances. Thomas said the design was strange. The window was too big. The roof was at a different angle, not the way they were used to. Ethan explained that the large window let in light and air. The slope of the roof was for water runoff. Thomas shrugged and got to work. 3 days later, the first new hut stood. Small, a little crooked, but sturdy. Nora went inside and began to cry, quietly, covering her face with her hands. Gareth hugged her and said nothing. They had a home again. Ethan stood to the side and watched. He felt that same warm feeling in his chest. He was starting to get used to it. On the 38th day, 3 more people arrived. An old man with his grandson and a lone, middle-aged man. The old man's name was Alden, a former shepherd. His grandson's name was Finn, 10 years old, a quiet boy with big eyes. The single man's name was Reed, a former soldier. He had only 1 arm. He'd lost the other in a skirmish with goblins on the southern border. The army had discharged him. His family had disowned him. He'd been wandering for 2 months. Then he heard the beacon. Ethan took them all in. The lines multiplied. The numbers grew. By the 40th day, Heartwood's population stood at 11 souls. 11 people on dead land. It sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, but 11 people meant 11 pairs of hands, -1 for Reed. But Reed made up for it with sheer determination. He worked for 2. He dug with 1 hand faster than some could with 2. Ethan put him to work clearing new plots. Reed didn't ask questions. He just worked. By the 45th day, clover covered an area 100 paces by 100. The first compost had been worked into the soil. Ethan began preparing the land for wheat. The problem was the seeds. He'd found wild clover. You can't find wild wheat. He needed real seeds, and for seeds, he needed money or something to trade. Ethan had neither. He sat by the campfire that evening and counted. Mabel came over and sat down next to him. She asked what was wrong. Ethan said he needed wheat seeds and didn't know where to get them. Mabel thought for a moment. Then she said that 2 days' journey to the southeast was the town of Brackenmere. There was a market there on Thursdays. They sold seeds, but for money. Ethan asked what they had for sale. Mabel laughed. She said they had dirt and weeds. Ethan didn't laugh. He thought for a moment. Then he stood up and went over to Sun Min. She was sitting by her forge, sharpening a knife blade. Ethan sat down next to her. He asked how many nails she could forge in 2 days. Sun Min raised her head. She thought for a moment. She held up 3 fingers, then 2 more. 50. Ethan nodded. Nails were in short supply in Veldaria. Every blacksmith made them by hand. A good nail cost 1 copper coin. 50 nails meant 50 copper coins. 50 copper coins could buy a sack of seeds. 1 sack. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ethan returned to the campfire. He looked at the herbs drying on a rope near Mabel's hut. Yarrow, plantain, wild mint, sage. He gathered them every day, dried them. He tied them into bundles, just out of habit. But the herbs were worth money, especially the medicinal ones, especially in a kingdom where there had been 3 years of crop failure and people were getting sick from poor food. Ethan stood up. He went to count the bundles. He counted 43. If he sold each one for 2 copper coins, that's another 86 coins, plus 50 for the nails. 136 copper coins, 3 sacks of seeds, maybe 4 if he haggled. 4 sacks of wheat for the prepared soil. That would be enough to sow 2 acres. 2 acres of wheat yield about 600 pounds of grain in a good harvest. 600 pounds of grain are worth about 200 silver coins at the market. 200 silver coins is 20 gold coins. The royal tax on a plot of land the size of Heartwood is 10 gold coins. 10 gold coins for 3 months from barren land where nothing had grown for 500 years. Nothing had grown. The numbers added up, barely, by a hair, with no margin for error, but they added up. Ethan returned to the campfire. He sat down. He looked at Mabel. He said that in 2 days he was going to Brackenmere. Mabel frowned. She said he was an idiot, that in town they'd rob him or beat him up, or both. Ethan said that was exactly why he wouldn't go alone. In the morning he spoke with Reed. He asked if Reed would go with him to town. Reed looked him up and down. A one-armed soldier, a head taller than the skinny teenager. He asked why. Ethan said he needed someone who looked like no one would want to mess with him. Reed smirked. For the first time ever, he said that was his specialty. On the 46th day, Ethan and Reed set out for Brackenmere. Ethan carried a sack of bundles of grass. Reed carried a sack of nails, 50 of them, even, identical. Sun Min's work. Every nail was perfect, not a single burr or bend. Ethan looked at them before they left and thought that in his world, they would pay 10 times as much for such quality craftsmanship. The journey took a day and a half. Brackenmere turned out to be a small, dirty town with a wooden palisade and a single main street. The market occupied the square in front of City Hall. A dozen or so stalls, merchants, shoppers, guards. Ethan entered the market and immediately felt the difference. Beyond the settlement's borders, the system was silent. No lines, no numbers, no prompts. He was once again just an ordinary drifter with 0 stars. Skinny, dirty, in tattered clothes. A nobody. The first merchant he found was selling seeds. A fat man with a red face and 3 stars. A natural at trading. He looked down at Ethan, asked what he wanted. Ethan said wheat, a sack. The merchant named his price, 50 copper coins per sack. Ethan knew the real price was 30. The merchant had marked it up because he was dealing with a ragged beggar. Ethan didn't argue. He pulled out a bunch of yarrow, placed it on the counter, said he'd pay with herbs. The merchant raised an eyebrow. He took the bundle, sniffed it, rubbed it between his fingers, looked at Ethan more closely, said the yarrow was good, fresh, dried just right, asked where it was from. Ethan said from the north. The merchant grunted, said he'd give 3 copper coins for the bundle. Ethan knew the bundle was worth at least 5, but again, he didn't argue. He laid out 10 bundles. The merchant counted out 30 copper coins. Ethan added 20 coins from Sun Min's bag. He received a bag of seeds. Then he went to the next merchant. He laid out the nails. The nail merchant took one. He turned it over in his hand. He tried to bend it. It wouldn't bend. He looked at Ethan. He asked who had forged them. Ethan said his blacksmith had. The merchant asked where his blacksmith had learned the trade. Ethan said she was self-taught. The merchant raised his eyebrows. She? Then he looked at the nails again. He said that for that quality, he'd give 2 copper coins each, twice the usual price. Ethan sold 30 nails. He kept 20. With the money he earned, he bought a second bag of seeds, and a third, and a bundle of rope, and a piece of iron for Sun Min. On the way back, Reed was silent. Then he said one sentence. He said that Ethan bargained like a man who knew the value of things but not his own worth. Ethan didn't reply. They returned to Heartwood on the 48th day. 3 sacks of wheat seed, a rope, a piece of iron. Mabel met them at the gate. She saw the sacks and her eyes lit up. Ethan carried the sacks into the cabin. He lay down on the floor. He closed his eyes. His body ached from 2 days of walking, but numbers swirled in his head. 3 sacks, 2 acres, 50 days until the census. Wheat takes 70 days to grow, 20 days short. He opened his eyes. 20 days short. Even if he planted tomorrow, the wheat wouldn't be ready by the census. Ethan lay there, staring at the ceiling. Then he sat up. Then he stood up. He went outside. He looked at his field. Clover, green, lush, compost in the soil. The soil is ready. But time. There isn't enough time. He stood there thinking. He went over everything he knew in his head, and suddenly he remembered. Fast-growing crops. In his world, farmers used them when they needed a harvest in 30 or 40 days. Radishes, lettuce, turnips, peas. Some varieties of barley mature in 55 days, and here there's a system, one that doubles the composting speed. Could it speed up growth? Ethan sat down on the ground. He closed his eyes. He mentally addressed the system. He asked if there was a way to speed up crop growth. Silence. Then a chime. The blueprint is available for 200 settlement points. Enhanced growth, level 1. Increases the growth rate of crops within the settlement by 30%. Ethan checked his balance. 327 points. That's enough. He activated the blueprint. Minus 200. 127 remaining. New lines appeared. Enhanced growth activated. All crops within the settlement's radius are growing 30% faster. Ethan did the math. 70 days minus 30% equals 49 days. 50 days until the census. 1 day to spare. 1. He laughed. Quietly. Hoarsely. 1 day. The next morning, he planted 2 acres of wheat. On the 52nd day, the wheat had risen a palm's width above the ground. The green sprouts stood in neat rows like little soldiers. Ethan checked on them every morning. He felt the soil. He sniffed. He counted. The system showed progress. 17% until maturity. Growth rate normal. Acceleration active. Everything was going according to plan. Right up until the moment Mabel stepped out onto the porch that morning and looked up at the sky. She said one word. Drought. Ethan looked up. The sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. For anyone else, it would have been good weather. For an agronomist with 2 degrees, it was a disaster. Wheat in the growth stage drinks water like crazy. Without rain for a week, the well wouldn't be enough. Ethan walked over to the well. He peered down inside. The water level had dropped half a meter over the past 10 days. If the drought lasted another 2 weeks, the well would run dry. And without water, the wheat would die in 3 days. He stood over the well and thought it through. In his past life, the answer had been simple: irrigation, a system of canals, a reservoir, drip irrigation. But that would require pipes and pumps and plastic, none of which exist here. Or a river. Ethan mentally mapped out the area. The settlement covered a circle with a radius of a quarter-mile. Inside the circle, he could see every stone and every root. Beyond that, it was a blank. But Mabel had said there was a stream 3 miles to the northwest. A small one. It dries up in the summer but is full in the spring. It was late spring now. The stream should still be flowing. The problem was that 3 miles was beyond the settlement's border. Ethan couldn't expand the border. That would require settlers in the new territory. He called Reed over. He explained the situation. Reed listened. Then he said they could dig a canal from the stream to the settlement, 3 miles. Ethan looked at him, then at his people. 11 people. 3 of them were women. 1 was pregnant. 1 was 10 years old. 1 was an old man. A 3-mile canal. Reed shrugged. He said that in the war they dug longer trenches. Ethan nodded. On the 53rd day, he divided up the people. Sun Min stayed behind to forge. Mabel stayed behind to cook and watch over Nora. Finn stayed behind to help Mabel. Everyone else went to dig. Ethan marked out the route. A straight line from the stream to the well. The canal didn't have to be deep. Half a foot would be enough. But it had to be wide, so the water would flow by gravity along a gentle slope. He calculated the slope from memory. 2 inches per 100 feet. Enough for the water to flow. Not enough to wash away the walls. They dug for 4 days. Ethan worked alongside everyone else. The shovel went into the ground and came out. Went in and came out. Again and again. By the evening of the first day, his hands were covered in bloody blisters. By the second day, he could no longer feel his palms. By the third day, he could no longer feel his back. Reed dug with one hand and didn't complain. Gareth and Thomas worked in silence. Alden dug slowly but didn't stop. On the 4th day, they reached the stream. There was water, shallow, cold, clear. Ethan cut through the last narrow strip of earth between the canal and the stream. Water gushed out, slowly, in a thin stream. It flowed through the canal, downward, toward the settlement. They stood and watched as the water crept along their man-made channel. 3 miles. It took half a day to reach the well. Ethan diverted the flow into the drainage channel he dug that morning. The water flowed into the fields. The wheat was watered, rose in the air. Plus 40 settlement points. First irrigation. Achievement unlocked. Founder's lottery. Bonus roll. The wheel spun. The result? Water wheel. Ethan read the blueprint and this time didn't laugh. A water wheel on a stream means energy. Energy means a mill. A mill means flour. Flour means bread. Bread means money. He set the blueprint aside in his mind for later. Right now, something else was more important. The water was flowing. The wheat was thriving. But the canal was fragile. Its walls were made of ordinary soil. One good downpour and it would wash it away. It needed to be reinforced, with stone or clay. Ethan found clay on the bank of the stream, rich, dense clay, perfect for plastering. For the next 3 days, they coated the canal's walls. It was hard, dirty work, but when they finished, the canal looked like the real thing, even, smooth. The water flowed through it without any loss. Mabel stood at the edge of the canal and shook her head. She said that in her 68 years, she'd seen many wonders, but a little guy who makes water flow uphill, that's something new. Ethan said the water wasn't flowing uphill but down a slope of 2 inches per 100 feet. Mabel said he was talking like a madman again. Ethan smiled. On the 58th day, more people arrived. A family of 4, a husband, a wife, and 2 children. They were from a burned-down village to the east. Following them came a lone old man who was an herbalist and could no longer work because 3 of his fingers had been cut off to pay off his debts. Behind the old man came a young widow with an infant. Ethan took everyone in. He fed them. He gave them shelter. He gave work to those who could work. He gave rest to those who could not. The population had surpassed 20. Gareth and Thomas built non-stop. Huts sprang up around the first one like mushrooms after rain, crooked, small, but sturdy and dry. Sun Min forged nails, hinges, and bolts. Reed organized the night watch, 4 people in shifts. Not because Ethan ordered it, because Reed was a soldier and knew that a settlement without guards was a dead settlement. Ethan didn't argue. He was grateful. On the 60th day, what he had both been waiting for and feared at the same time happened. A group appeared from the southern road. A man, a girl, a boy of about 10. The man was large and walked with difficulty. The girl walked beside him, supporting the boy, who was limping. As they drew closer, Ethan saw that the man was old. Not as old as Mabel, but close. His hands were covered in flour, an apron, a miller or a baker. The girl, 16 years old, blonde hair, freckles, eyes red from crying, but a smile. She was smiling through her tears, and that combination struck Ethan right in the chest, so that for a second he forgot he was 34, not 16. The boy. His leg was bandaged with a rag, blood. A man stopped in front of Ethan. He said they were from the village of Elmswood. Bandits had burned down the village a week ago. His wife had been killed. He'd taken the children and fled. They'd been walking for 7 days. The boy was wounded. They needed help. Ethan called for Mabel. Mabel examined the boy's leg. The wound had become infected. They needed yarrow and a clean bandage. Ethan had both. Mabel cleaned the wound. She bandaged it. The boy stopped crying. The girl approached Ethan. She said her name was Clara Whitefield. She asked if they could stay. Ethan said they could. Clara looked at the wheat field, at the huts, at the people who were working, building, and living. She said it was beautiful. Ethan looked at her. No one had ever called Heartwood beautiful before. Lines, plus 25 for each, plus 75. 23 residents, hidden talent discovered. Clara Whitefield, talent, doe, 2 stars. Ethan read the description and raised his eyebrows. Doe. She could literally see how the bread would smell a day from now. She could sense when the dough was ready. She knew the proportions instinctively. 2 stars for a talent that was considered useless. Who needs a talent for dough when there are swords and magic? But Ethan knew the value of bread. Bread is life. Bread is trade. Bread is what people build cities and wage wars for. Clara Whitefield, with her talent for dough, was worth more to Heartwood than 10 swordsmen. She just didn't know it yet. Ethan showed her the old oven in Mabel's cabin. Clara looked at the oven. She touched the stones. She peered inside. She said the oven was good. Old, but good. If the draft were fixed, it would work. Ethan asked if she could bake bread. Clara looked at him as if he were strange. She said, of course she could. It was the only thing she knew how to do. Ethan said that was the only thing he needed right now. That evening, Clara baked the first loaf of bread in Heartwood. The flour was coarse, made from the leftover grain Ethan had bought in Brackenmere. The oven smoked. The conditions were the worst possible. But the bread smelled so good that Sun Min came out of the blacksmith shop for the first time in a month and walked over to the table. Mabel sliced the bread and passed it around to everyone. 23 people sat around a communal table under the open sky and ate the bread, in silence. Clara stood to the side and watched them eat. There was an expression on her face that I recognized. Surprise. She was used to her talent being worth nothing. And here were 23 people eating her bread in a silence broken only by the sound of chewing. Ethan walked over to her. He said the bread was excellent. Clara smiled, widely, brightly, through the tears that were flowing again. She said thank you. Ethan nodded and returned to the table. He sat down. He took a piece of bread, took a bite, and caught himself thinking, in the 34 years of his past life, he had never once had dinner in such a silence of happiness. He quietly said one word, thank you. Not to Clara, not to Mabel, just out loud. Everyone looked up. Mabel wiped a tear with her apron. Lyra. No, Leah wasn't there yet. He shook his head. He corrected himself. For the first time that evening, Sun Min looked up from the floor to the people around her. Reed sat upright and said nothing, but his face was calm, not stony as usual, but calm. Clara was crying and laughing at the same time. Finn had fallen asleep with his head on the table. Nora was stroking her belly and smiling. Lines in the air, plus 120 settlement points. 20 residents reached. Unlocked. Farmstead status. Ethan looked at the numbers and did the math. A farmstead. Officially. In the royal records, this meant the settlement existed, that it had a name, that it couldn't simply be wiped off the map. 30 days until the census. On the 65th day, a carriage arrived in Heartwood. Not a peasant's wagon, a carriage, with curtains on the windows and a coat of arms on the door. The Valancourt coat of arms, a golden hawk on a blue field. Reed was the first to see it. He stood in the gate. He placed his hand on the hilt of his knife, his only hand. Ethan walked over and stood beside him. The carriage stopped. The door opened. A girl stepped out, 17 years old. Her back was straight. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun. She wore a gray silk dress that cost more than everything in Heartwood put together. She scanned the courtyard, the shacks, the field, the people, the compost piles. Her nose wrinkled. She looked at Ethan. She asked if he was Ethan Heartwood. Ethan said yes. She said her name was Lyra Valancourt, the Count's daughter. Her father had sent her to visit. Ethan looked at her in silence. He knew why she was here. Not to visit, to spy. Count Valancourt wanted to know what was happening on the dead land. He wanted to know where the clover, the wheat, and the people came from. He wanted to know how much grain and money Ethan had, and where his weaknesses lay. And he sent his daughter because a 17-year-old girl is harder to drive away than a squad of soldiers. Ethan smiled. He said there was a room. One. She'd be sleeping with Mabel. Lyra straightened up even more. It seemed impossible, but she did it. She said she was the Count's daughter. Ethan nodded. He said he knew. And Mabel was her grandmother, and Grandma had the warmest cabin. Mabel stepped out onto the porch. She looked Lyra up and down. She said one word, "Wash up." Lyra opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She looked at her carriage. The coachman was already turning the horse around. She had no choice. Her father had ordered her to stay. She followed Mabel. Mabel led her to a barrel of water. She handed her a rag. She told her to wash up. Lyra looked at the rag as if it were a poisonous snake. Mabel stood there waiting, her arms crossed over her chest. Lyra washed her hands, then her face. Then Mabel said she had to wash the dishes too. For the first time in her life, Lyra washed a bowl. Ethan watched from around the corner of the hut. Two feelings were battling inside him. The first, caution. Lyra was a spy. Everything she saw would go to the Count, every detail, every number, every weak spot. The second, curiosity. 3 stars of awakening, the talent for precise calculation, a perfect memory for numbers and record-keeping. If Lyra were on his side, she would be the perfect accountant. If. He returned to his work. The wheat was growing. The system showed 43% until maturity, 25 days until the census. The numbers added up. Barely, but they added up. That evening at the communal table, Lyra sat on the edge of the bench. She ate soup with a spoon she held between 2 fingers. She grimaced at every spoonful. Clara placed some bread in front of her. Lyra looked at the bread. She took a bite. She stopped grimacing. Clara's bread could silence any critic. Ethan sat across from her. He watched. He thought. Then he noticed. Lyra pushed away the wild onion that Mabel had added to the soup. Carefully, with the tip of her spoon, she fished out every piece and set it aside on the edge of the bowl. Ethan took note. In the morning, Mabel served breakfast. Boiled eggs. The 3 hens that Alden had brought laid 2 eggs each a day. Not much, but valuable. Ethan placed an egg in front of Lyra, without the onion. He had silently fished the onion out of her portion while Mabel wasn't looking. Lyra picked up her spoon. She looked at the egg. She looked at Ethan. She froze. He had already turned away and was eating his own portion. Lyra sat there with the spoon in her hand for 30 seconds, not moving. Something broke in her face. Something small and invisible. Like a crack in a wall that you can only see if you know where to look. Ethan knew where to look, because he remembered what it was like when no one noticed that you weren't eating the onions. Lines in the air. Resident. Lyra. Trust. 5 out of 100. Number 11 out of 100. From 5 to 11 for a single egg without onions. Lyra spent 3 days in Heartwood, and during those 3 days, several things happened. First, she saw how Ethan worked. From morning till night, without breaks, without complaints. He dug and sowed and carried water and repaired the roof and took inventory and explained to people what to do and why. He didn't give orders, he explained. Second, she saw how people looked at Ethan, not as a master, not as a boss, as a person they trusted. Third, she saw a field of wheat, green, alive, on land where nothing had grown for 500 years. She stood at the edge of the field and calculated. The 3 stars of precise calculation did the math themselves. Area, seeding rate, estimated yield. And the number they came up with was beyond her comprehension. If the wheat ripened, the harvest from this field would cover the tax, not just barely, but with a surplus, a huge surplus. She returned to the hut and took a piece of paper and a quill from her travel bag. She wrote a report to her father, her first. In it, she described a settlement of 25 people on barren land with a wheat field and an irrigation canal. It was all true. All the figures were accurate. She sealed it and handed it to the coachman who arrived on the 3rd day. The coachman drove off. Lyra stood there watching him go, and she thought about an egg without onions. On the 68th day, Lyra asked Ethan for the accounting books. Ethan looked at her. He asked what books she meant. Lyra said the accounts, income, expenses, inventory, and assets. Ethan laughed. He said that Mabel kept their accounts, in her head. Leah turned pale. She said that was unacceptable, that any household without records was doomed. Ethan shrugged. He said that if she wanted to, she could handle the bookkeeping herself. Lyra froze. He was offering her a job. A real job. Not cleaning or washing dishes. A job that made use of her talent. 3 stars of precise calculation. No one had ever offered her a job before. Her father had used her talent to verify the manager's reports. But that wasn't a job. It was surveillance, a tool. Here she was being asked to do the math not for surveillance, but to ensure that 25 people wouldn't go hungry in the winter. Lyra took a piece of paper and a quill. She sat down at the table and began to calculate. 2 hours later, she approached Ethan with a look on her face as if she'd seen a ghost. She said that according to her calculations, if the wheat ripened and the harvest was average, Heartwood would be able to pay 10 times more tax than Ravenhall. Ethan nodded. He said he knew. Lyra asked how he could know that without any records. Ethan tapped his temple. He said he was doing the math in his head. Lyra looked at him for a long time. Then she said that he was either a genius or a liar, and that in 22 days they would find out which of the two he was. Ethan smiled. Lyra wrote her second report to her father on the 71st day. The numbers in it were correct, but some details were omitted. She didn't mention the canal. She didn't mention the forge. She didn't mention Sun Min. Lines in the air. A resident of Lyra. Trust rating, 11 out of 100. Number 14 out of 100. She wasn't on his side yet, but she had already stopped being completely on her father's side. Ethan noticed this and said nothing. On the 75th day, a nun in a gray habit knocked on the gate of Heartwood. Ethan opened the gate himself. She stood before him, calm and upright. Her face was half hidden by her hood. Her voice was steady. She asked for a place to stay for the night. She said she was heading north to a monastery. She was tired. Just one night, and she'd leave in the morning. Ethan let her in. Lines: new contact, name unknown, trust 0 out of 100, threat level undetermined. Ethan read the line twice. Threat level. The system had never displayed a threat level before. Not for Mabel. Not for Sun Min. Not for Lyra. Not for anyone. This line appeared for the first time, and it was flashing. Ethan looked at the nun. She was standing in the courtyard looking around, calmly, intently, like someone accustomed to memorizing everything at a glance. Mabel brought her a bowl of soup. The nun thanked her. She ate neatly, not greedily, without rushing. Her hands were clean. Her nails were neat. Too clean for a wandering nun. Ethan pulled Mabel aside. He whispered that something was off about the nun. Mabel nodded. She said she'd noticed. She said that wandering nuns don't walk with their backs straight or eat soup as if they'd been taught court etiquette. Ethan nodded, but he couldn't turn her away. He didn't want to. If she was dangerous, it was better to know where she was than to wonder where she was wandering outside his sight. The nun introduced herself as Iris. Just Iris, no last name. Ethan gave her a bunk in Mabel's cabin, next to Lyra. Lyra looked at Iris. Iris looked at Lyra. Something passed between them. Recognition. Not personal, class-based. Both had grown up among people in power, and both saw it in each other. Lyra looked away first. On the 76th day, Iris asked permission to stay one more day. Her leg hurt. Ethan allowed it. On the 77th, she asked for another day. Ethan allowed it. On the 78th day, she stopped asking and started helping. She carried water. She chopped wood. She worked in silence, quickly, efficiently. Too efficiently for a nun. Ethan watched. The system kept flashing the threat level. Trust was at 0. It didn't budge. Usually, trust would start to rise after 2 or 3 days if a person stayed and worked. Iris's was at 0. It was as if the system knew something Ethan didn't. On the 79th day, Ethan went out at night to relieve himself. It was dark. The moon was hidden behind the clouds. He was walking toward the outhouse that Gareth had built behind the huts, and he heard a voice. Quiet, rapid, monotonous, like a prayer, but not a prayer. Ethan crept closer. Iris was standing behind the well with her back to him. Her hands were folded across her chest. Something was glowing on her fingers, a dim, bluish glow. She was speaking quickly and quietly. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but he saw the glow. It was magic. A wandering nun with magic. At least 5 stars. Ethan stepped back. He went back to the cabin. He lay down. He didn't sleep until morning. In the morning, he went to see Mabel. He sat down next to her. He quietly told her what he'd seen. Mabel listened. Her expression didn't change. Then she said she'd seen that glow once in her life. A long time ago, 20 years ago, on the day they took her son away. People in gray cloaks with a blue glow on their fingers. They came and said her son was the chosen one. 5 stars, the seal of talent. They were taking him into the order. Mabel didn't know which order. They didn't tell her. They just took the boy and left. And not a word since then. Not a letter. Not a single word. 20 years. Ethan sat next to her and said nothing. Then he asked what her son's name was. Mabel answered quietly. Torin. Torin Thorn. Ethan froze. The name. Torin. He'd heard it before. At night. The Heartwood Core had whispered names to him. 4 names. 4 zeros who had come before him and died within the first month. But there was one more name. A 5th. Not a 0. Something else. He couldn't remember it. It slipped away like a fish from his hands. Torin. Torin Thorn. He didn't know if these names were connected. Not yet, anyway. Ethan stood up. He walked over to Iris. She was standing by the field, looking at the wheat. The stalks were already knee-high. Golden tips were beginning to appear at the tops. 2 weeks until harvest. Ethan stood beside her, silently. They stood like that for a minute, 2. Then Iris said the field was beautiful. Ethan said the wheat was growing 30% faster than it should. Iris turned her head. She looked at him. Her eyes were gray, cold. But something flashed in them, curiosity. She asked why it was growing faster. Ethan said the soil here was special. Iris was silent for a moment. Then she said she knew that the soil here really was special, and that was exactly why she had come. Ethan turned toward her. She didn't look away. She looked straight at him. Ethan asked who she was. Iris replied that she was a nun. Ethan said that nuns don't glow blue at night. Iris froze. Then she smiled. Her first smile, subtle, cold, but a smile. She said he was observant for a farmer. Ethan said he was observant for anyone. Iris was silent for a moment. Then she said she couldn't answer his question. Not yet. But that she wouldn't harm the settlement. Ethan asked why he should believe her. Iris looked out at the field, at the huts, at Mabel, who was hanging up laundry, at Clara, who was carrying bread out of the oven, at Sun Min, who was hammering away in the smithy. Then she said she'd been here for 4 days. If she'd wanted to cause harm, she would have done so already. Ethan thought it over. She was right. 5 stars and combat magic. She could have destroyed everything in a minute. But she hadn't. Ethan nodded. He said she could stay. But if he saw a threat to his people, no 5 stars would save her. Iris raised an eyebrow. She asked what he would do. He was 0 stars. Ethan looked her in the eyes. He said he didn't need stars to protect his home. Iris looked at him for 5 seconds. Then she nodded. She left. Entries. Resident. Iris. Trust. 0 out of 100. Threat level. Flashing. No changes. Ethan stood alone in the field. He was thinking. The nun with 5 stars and a blue glow hadn't come here by accident. She knew about the land. She knew it was special. That meant she knew about the core, or about what lay beneath the core, or about the order that had hidden something here 500 years ago. The question wasn't who she was. The question was who had sent her, and why. That evening they had a communal dinner. 30 people at the table. Mabel served the soup. Clara passed the bread. Everyone ate. Ethan sat on the edge of the bench and looked at his people. 30 souls. 60 days ago he had just 1 old woman and a broken shovel. Now he had 30 people, a wheat field, a canal, a blacksmith shop, 3 dozen huts, a farmstead, his farmstead, on land everyone had considered dead. 15 days until the census. On the 82nd day, a girl ran into Heartwood. She literally ran in. She burst through the gate at full speed, crashed into Reed, and bounced off him like a ball off a wall. Reed didn't flinch. He looked down. The girl was lying on the ground, small, skinny, filthy beyond belief. Her hair was matted into tangles. Her clothes were nothing but holes held together with thread. She raised her head. She looked at Reed. She looked at his single arm. She looked at the knife on his belt. She jumped to her feet and ran the other way. Reed didn't chase after her. He called out to Ethan. Ethan came out. He saw the girl huddled behind the barn, peeking out from there with one eye. She was about 15, maybe 14. Hard to say. Hunger and filth erase a person's age. Ethan approached the barn, not too close. He sat down on the ground. He asked her name. Silence. He asked where she was from. Silence. He asked if she was hungry. A pause. Then a hand poked out from around the corner. Dirty, small, with gnawed-down nails. The hand didn't ask for anything. It just reached out, as if checking to see if he would hit it. Ethan stood up. He walked over to Mabel. He took a bowl of soup and a piece of Clara's bread. He came back. He set them on the ground 2 steps away from the barn. He stepped back. He sat down on a log. He waited. The hand reached out again. It felt for the bowl, dragged it around the corner. The sounds of eating, quick, greedy. 3 minutes later, the empty bowl rolled out from around the corner. Ethan took the bowl, brought more. He stepped back again. The second serving disappeared just as quickly. After the third serving, a girl came out from behind the barn. She stood in front of him and watched. Her eyes were big, wary, but no longer wild. Ethan asked her name again. She said she didn't know. People had always called her, "Hey, you," or "thief." Ethan nodded. He asked where she was from. She said she was from everywhere and nowhere. Born somewhere, lived everywhere. She stole from markets. She ran from the guards. The last time was in the city of Crosshaven. She stole 3 apples. A guard chased her for 2 blocks. She escaped across the rooftops. She ran north. Then she sensed something. Warmth. A direction. She ran this way. A beacon. Ethan looked at her. A single star of awakening. A talent. The lines flashed. Hidden talent detected. Ginny O'Brien. Talent. Shadow. Ethan read the description. Shadow. She's hard to see when she stands still. Not invisibility, just that the eye glides right past her, as if she were part of a wall or a tree or a shadow. The perfect talent for a scout. Or a thief. Ethan looked at the girl. She was leaning against the barn wall, and sure enough, his gaze wanted to slip away from her. He had to make a conscious effort to keep his attention on her. Ethan said she needed a name. She shrugged. She said names were for people. Ethan said she was a person. She looked at him as if he'd said something impossible. Ethan thought for a moment. He asked if she liked the name Ginny. The system had suggested it. She grimaced. She said it was too long. Ethan said, "Then how about Jay?" She thought about it. She nodded. She said that would work. Ethan stood up. He said Jay could stay if she wanted to. There's a cabin. There's food. There's work. Jay crossed her arms over her chest. She asked what kind of work. Ethan said he didn't know yet. They'd figure it out. Jay looked at him suspiciously. She asked what he wanted in return. Ethan said nothing. Jay said that didn't happen. Ethan said it does. Jay said he was lying. Ethan shrugged and went to work. He left her standing by the barn. An hour later, Jay was sitting on the barn roof, dangling her feet. 2 hours later, she snatched a spoon from Mabel. Mabel noticed it was missing 5 minutes later and screamed so loud the whole yard could hear her. Jay was sitting on the roof, grinning. Mabel looked up. She saw the spoon in Jay's hands. She said that if the spoon wasn't returned in 3 seconds, Jay would get hit in the forehead with it. Jay threw the spoon. Mabel caught it midair. Jay laughed, for the first time. A hoarse, staccato laugh, like a cough, but a laugh. The next day, Ethan was working in the field. The wheat was waist-high, golden, heavy. Less than a week until harvest. He touched the ears of wheat and counted the days. The system showed 87%. Everything was going according to plan. Everything was working out. And that was exactly why a sense of unease was growing inside him. Too good. In his past life, he'd learned one thing. When everything's going well, expect a blow. The blow didn't take long to come. On the 84th day, Reed came running. At a run. For a one-armed former soldier, running meant serious trouble. Reed said there was a mounted squad on the southern road. 8 riders, not soldiers, mercenaries, armed, heading straight for us. Ethan sat up straight. He asked whose they were. Reed didn't know, but Sun Min knew. She stood in the doorway of the blacksmith shop, looking south. Her face was pale. Her hands gripped the handle of her hammer so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She whispered a single word. The master. Ethan turned to her. He understood. Sun Min's former master had sent men after his runaway slave. 8 mercenaries, against 30 peasants with shovels and 1 blacksmith's wife with a hammer. Ethan looked at his people. Women, children, old people, former carpenters, a former shepherd, a one-armed soldier, pregnant Nora, 10-year-old Finn. Clara, who knows how to bake bread, not fight. He couldn't lead them out into the field against 8 armed mercenaries. But he couldn't hand Sun Min over either. Ethan closed his eyes, opened them, looked at the field, at the huts, at the canal, at the barn where the first harvest of barley and vegetables was already stored, at everything they had built in 84 days. Then he looked at Sun Min. She stood tall, a hammer in her hands. She didn't ask for protection. She was already ready to face them alone, so as not to endanger the others. Ethan walked over to her. He stood beside her. He said quietly, "You're not going anywhere." She looked at him. There was something in her eyes he couldn't read. Ethan turned to Reed. He said he needed an hour. Reed nodded. He said he'd hold them up on the road. He had a knife in one hand. That would last 10 minutes. Ethan said 10 minutes was too long. He needed 3. And he began to speak. Quickly, clearly, like a man who'd been in charge of people for 7 years. Reed goes out onto the road. Don't fight. Talk. Buy time. Gareth and Thomas grab their axes and take up positions behind the barn. Alden leads the children and women to the far cabin. No, not all the women. Sun Min stays behind, with a hammer. Jay goes up on the roof. She's small and can't be seen. If anything goes wrong, she'll run to Brackenmere for the guards. Lyra. Ethan looked at Lyra. Lyra stood there, pale. Her hands were shaking. But she wasn't hiding. Ethan said one sentence to her. He said the mercenaries needed to know whose coat of arms hung above the gate. Lyra didn't understand. Then she did. The Valancourt coat of arms. She's the Count's daughter. If the mercenaries find out that the Valancourt Count's daughter lives in Heartwood, then an attack on Heartwood is an attack on the Count's guest. And an attack on the Count's daughter is a death sentence for any mercenary in the kingdom. Lyra ran into the hut. She came out a minute later. In her hands she held a gray silk dress, the very one she'd arrived in, and a locket bearing the Valancourt hawk. She put it around her neck. She stood at the gate, back straight, face impassive. The Count's daughter. The mercenaries arrived 20 minutes later. Reed stood in the middle of the road, alone, with a knife. They stopped. The leader of the mercenaries, a large man with a scar across his face, looked down at Reed. He asked where the runaway slave with the brand on her shoulder was. Reed said he didn't know of any slave. The mercenary spat and urged his horse forward. Reed didn't budge. The mercenary stopped. He looked more closely. He saw the empty sleeve. He saw the bearing, a former soldier. He smirked, said he had no time for cripples. He rode around Reed. The squad approached the gate and saw Lyra, the medallion, the Valancourt's hawk, gray silk. The lead mercenary pulled on the reins so hard that the horse reared up. He looked at the coat of arms. He looked at Lyra. He looked at the coat of arms again. He asked who she was. Lyra replied in a voice that made the air temperature drop 10 degrees. She said she was Lyra Valancourt, the daughter of Count Sebastian Valancourt, the lord of this province, and that this settlement was under her father's protection. The mercenary turned pale. One of his men pulled the horse back. Another cursed under his breath. The leader sat motionless. He thought. Then he asked if she was indeed the Count's daughter. Lyra slowly removed her locket. She held it out to him. The mercenary took it. He turned it over. He saw the engraving on the back. He handed it back. His hands trembled slightly. He turned his horse around. He told his men they were leaving. One of the mercenaries asked what about the slave girl. The leader barked that the master could deal with Count Valancourt himself if he valued his life. They rode off. The dust settled. It grew quiet. Lyra stood at the gate, clutching the locket. Her hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from the realization of what she had just done. She had used her father's name to protect the settlement her father wanted to destroy. She had protected a runaway slave in the name of the man who owned the very master from whom Sun Min had fled. Lyra looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at her. He nodded. With a single nod, Lyra lowered her head. Then she raised it. Then she walked into the hut. Lines. Resident. Lira. Trust. 14 out of 100. Number 29 out of 100. Spike. Sun Min approached Lira, silently. She stood in front of her. Lyra looked up. Sun Min bowed, deeply, to her waist. Then she straightened up and went into the smithy. Lyra stood there watching her go. Her face bore an expression Ethan had never seen before. Not pride, not relief, confusion. Like someone who, for the first time in their life, had done something right and didn't know how to feel about it. That evening, Ethan sat alone on the porch. 5 days until the census. The wheat was 93% ripe. 32 residents. The granary is full. The mercenaries have been driven off. Lyra is on his side. Or is starting to be. Iris is watching. Jay is stealing spoons. Mabel is cooking soup. Clara is baking bread. Sun Min is forging. Reed is on guard. Gareth is building. Finn ran across the porch with a piece of bread in his teeth. Jay's shadow flashed past him. Mabel called out from the kitchen, telling them not to run around the house. Ethan closed his eyes. He leaned against the wall and spoke quietly, addressing the ground beneath his feet. 5 days. Then they'll find out. Everyone will find out. On the 87th day, the wheat ripened. Ethan went out into the field at dawn and saw gold. Not coins, real gold. The ears of wheat stood heavy and full. They bent under the weight of the grain, and the morning sun bathed them in a color this land hadn't seen in 500 years. Ethan plucked an ear of wheat. He rubbed it between his palms. The grains spilled onto his skin. Large, solid, warm. He brought them to his nose. He inhaled, and he stood there for a long time. He just stood there, holding the grains in his open palm. The system showed 100%. Ripening complete. The crop was ready for harvest. But Ethan wasn't looking at the data. He was looking at the field, at the 2 acres of golden wheat in the middle of the land everyone considered cursed. And a lump formed in his throat. Mabel approached quietly. She stood beside him. She said nothing. Then she sighed softly. She said she hadn't seen anything more beautiful in 68 years. Ethan nodded. He couldn't speak. It was silly. It was just wheat. Just grain. But this grain had grown from dead earth. From acidified, depleted, forgotten soil. From mud and compost and clover and sweat. From the knowledge he'd brought from another world. From the stubbornness that had kept him from lying down and dying on that first night. He swallowed. He turned toward the huts. He shouted a single word. Harvest! And everything sprang into action. 32 people went out into the field. Those who had sickles took them. Those who didn't cut the stalks with knives. The children gathered the fallen ears of grain. Mabel tied the sheaves. Nora, who could barely walk now that she was 7 months pregnant, sat in the shade and sorted the grain. Reed mowed with one hand and managed to do it faster than many who used both. Gareth and Thomas hauled the sheaves into the barn. Sun Min sharpened the sickles right there in the field. Clara prepared food for everyone. Lyra kept track of the harvest. She stood with paper and pen, recording every sheaf, every sack, every pound. The 3 stars of precise calculation were working at full capacity. Jay darted back and forth between everyone like a crazy squirrel. She carried water. She handed out tools. She stole pastries from Mabel and handed them out to the children, thinking no one was watching. Mabel saw. And she'd place an extra pastry on the edge of the table where Jay could snatch it. Iris worked alongside everyone else, silently, quickly. Her gray cloak flitted across the golden field like the shadow of a cloud. Ethan looked at her sometimes. She never once raised her head, never once met his gaze. But she worked. The harvest lasted 2 days. By evening on the 2nd day, the last sheaf had been brought into the barn. Lyra approached Ethan with a piece of paper. Her hands were stained with ink. Her eyes were ablaze. She read out the figures. 400 sacks of grain, 80 barrels of honey. The honey came from wild bees that Alden had found in an old oak tree on the edge of the settlement. 200 heads of cheese. Mabel made the cheese from the milk of 4 goats that the refugees had brought from Elmswood. 40 plows that Sun Min had been forging for the past 3 weeks to sell. 12 boxes of dried herbs. Ethan listened and nodded. The numbers were higher than he'd expected, much higher. Enhanced growth hadn't just accelerated the wheat. Everything growing on the settlement's land was growing faster. Grasses, vegetables, clover in the new plots. Even the goats were producing more milk. The system was working. 87% broken, but it was working. Lyra finished reading the figures and looked at Ethan. She said that the total value of what was in the barn was approximately 1,200 gold pieces. The royal land tax on Heartwood was 10 gold pieces. Ethan smiled. He knew that. But it was nice to hear it from Lyra. 1,200 gold pieces from land that hadn't yielded a single copper coin in 500 years. Lyra added that all of Ravenhall paid 100 gold pieces in taxes per year. Ethan could pay 12 times that much, from a single harvest, from 2 acres, and he still had 500 square miles of land that he had only just begun to cultivate. Lyra fell silent. Then she said quietly that it was impossible. Ethan replied that it was agronomy. Lyra asked what agronomy was. Ethan said it was the science of how to nourish the land so that the land could nourish people. Leah looked at him as if he had said something in a language she didn't know but wanted to learn. That evening, Ethan couldn't sleep. The 88th day. Tomorrow the official would arrive. Tomorrow, everything would be decided. He lay on the floor of the cabin and stared at the ceiling. Mabel was snoring nearby. Through the wall, he could hear Reed patrolling the perimeter. Somewhere, the smithy door creaked. Sun Min wasn't sleeping either. Ethan got up. He went outside. The night was warm. The stars were bright. He walked toward the field, empty now, reduced to stubble, but alive. The earth beneath his feet was warm, soft, dark, healthy. 3 months ago, it had been gray as ash. Now it smelled of life. Ethan crouched down. He placed his palm on the ground. He closed his eyes. The Heartwood core hummed quietly in his head, as always. But tonight the hum was different, deeper, warmer, as if the core, too, knew that tomorrow was an important day. And then he heard it, quietly, at the very edge of his consciousness. A voice. Not the system, not a bell. A voice. A man's. Old. Tired. The voice said one word. Finally. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the ground. He placed his other hand on it. The voice was silent, but Ethan could feel it. Beneath him. Deep down. Something was there. Something was waiting. He stood up, brushed the dirt off his knees. He walked back. Tomorrow. Tomorrow first. On the 89th day, a procession appeared from the southern road. 3 horsemen. A carriage bearing the royal coat of arms. 2 guards. Ethan stood at the gate and waited. Behind him stood all of Heartwood. 32 people. Silent. Mabel in a clean apron. Sun Min with hands black from blacksmith soot. Lyra in a simple dress without silk. Clara with flour on her cheek. Reed to Ethan's right. Jay on the barn roof. Iris in the shadows by the well. The carriage came to a stop. An official stepped out. A small, gaunt man with glasses on his nose and a quill pen tucked behind his ear. Behind him came a clerk carrying a thick book. The guards remained on their horses. The official looked around. He looked at the huts, at the field, at the people, at the canal. His eyebrows crept upward. He took a piece of paper out of his pocket. He read it aloud. Heartwood land. Owner, Ethan Heartwood. Status, fallow land. Expected tax, 0. Note, prepare a deed of forfeiture. The official looked up from the paper. He looked at Ethan. He asked if he was Ethan Heartwood. Ethan said he was. The official asked if he was ready for the census. Ethan said he was. And he led him to the barn. He opened the doors. The official entered. He stopped. The clerk followed. He dropped his book. 400 sacks of grain stood in neat rows from wall to wall. 80 barrels of honey lined the right wall. 200 heads of cheese sat on the shelves that Gareth had put together yesterday. 40 plows in bundles of 10. 12 crates of herbs. And separately in the corner, sacks of vegetables and root crops. Turnips, beets, carrots, onions. Everything Ethan had grown in small plots while the wheat was ripening. The official stood and looked. Then he went out. He came back in. He went out. He came in a third time. He took off his glasses, wiped them, put them back on. He looked at Ethan. He asked in a trembling voice if all of this belonged to him. Ethan said it belonged to Heartwood. The official took out a quill. His hands were shaking. He began to write. Lyra approached and placed her ledger in front of him. The official looked at the entries, then at Lyra, then at the entries again. He asked who had kept the records. Lyra said she had. The official flipped through a few pages. Every entry was perfect. Every number was verified. The 3 stars of precise calculation allowed for no errors. The official set the book down and looked at Ethan with an expression that Ethan didn't immediately recognize. Then he recognized it. It was fear. The small, gaunt official was afraid. Because standing before him was a boy with 0 stars who, in 90 days, had accomplished what 500 years of magicians, priests, and nobles with arms full of stars had failed to do. And the official didn't understand how. Ethan calmly placed a bag of coins on the table in front of him. The official untied it. He counted the coins. 100 gold pieces. The tax on Heartwood's land was 10. Ethan paid 100, 10 times more. The official counted it twice, then 3 times. The clerk stood nearby, his mouth agape, a forgotten quill in his hand. The official asked why 100 and not 10. Ethan said it was because he could, and because he wanted it clearly recorded in the royal ledgers. Heartwood's land is not dead. Heartwood's land pays more than Ravenhall. A crowd began to gather at the gate, people from neighboring villages. Word of the census spread quickly. The peasants came to watch as the boy with 0 stars was sent to the mines. Instead, they saw a granary full of grain and an official with trembling hands. Someone in the crowd recognized Ethan. He shouted that this was the very same empty one from Ravenhall. The crowd fell silent. Everyone stared at Ethan, skinny, dirty, in work clothes, with calluses on his hands and dirt under his fingernails. 0 stars. And behind him, a granary worth more than anything these people had ever seen in their lives. The official stamped the document with a trembling hand. He read it aloud. Heartwood land, tax paid in full. Deadland status revoked. The land is secured for the Heartwood settlement for all eternity. The words hung in the air. Plus 500 settlement points. Tax paid. Land secured forever. Unlocked. Recognized village status. Ethan read the lines and remained silent. Behind him, Mabel wiped her eyes with her apron. Sun Min stood motionless, but the corner of her mouth twitched. It was a smile. Her first real smile. Clara was crying and laughing at the same time, as always. Lyra stood beside her, hiding her face in her hands. Reed stood upright. His face was stony, but his eyes were shining. Jay sat on the roof, dangling her feet, quietly, without her usual banter. Iris stood in the shadows behind the well. She looked at Ethan. She didn't move. The crowd began to murmur. People were talking among themselves, whispering. Someone crossed themselves. Someone cursed. Someone ran toward Ravenhall to spread the news. The official gathered his papers. He got into a carriage. He drove off. The dust settled. Ethan stood in the courtyard of his village. His village. And then, behind the official, a new cloud of dust rose. Bigger. Thicker. Another carriage. Black. With a golden hawk on the door. The Valancourt coat of arms. Ethan exhaled. He knew this would happen. He'd known from day one. For 90 days he'd been preparing for the tax, and for all 90 days he'd known that the tax wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The carriage stopped. The door opened. Count Sebastian Valancourt stepped out of the carriage, and Heartwood Manor seemed to shrink. Not physically, but the air grew thick. The 5 stars of awakening pressed down on everything around him like an invisible press. The talent of earth mastery. Ethan felt it in his skin. The grass beneath the Count's feet turned yellow. It wasn't dying, but it was fading, as if the earth beneath his feet were acknowledging its master. Not Ethan. Another master. The Count was tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair with early gray at the temples, a handsome face, intelligent, attentive eyes. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who was used to getting everything he wanted because he always wanted something sensible. The Count stopped in the middle of the courtyard. He looked around. He saw the field, the huts, the canal, the barn, the people. His gaze lingered on Lyra. His daughter was standing by the wall of a hut in a simple dress. No silk, no medallion, with ink stains on her fingers. The Count looked at her for 2 seconds. His expression didn't change. Then he looked at Ethan. He smiled. He said that Ethan had done the impossible, that he was delighted. His voice was soft, warm, sincere. The Count wasn't lying. He really was delighted, because everything Ethan had built in 30 days was supposed to belong to him. The Count walked over to the barn. Ethan didn't stop him. The Count peered inside. He nodded. He came out. He walked across the field. He crouched down. He touched the ground. His eyes widened. He sensed it. The 5 stars of Earth's dominion sensed what was impossible. The dead Earth had come to life. Not through magic, not through prayer, through something else. Something the Count didn't understand and that frightened him more than any magic. The Count stood up. He brushed off his hands. He returned to Ethan. He stopped smiling. He said that such a treasure could not belong to a nameless nobody, that in 30 days he would return with an army and take it, by fair means or by foul. Ethan stood there and listened. He said nothing. The Count waited for a reaction. Fear, anger, a plea, anything. Ethan gave him nothing. He just stood there and watched. The Count turned away. He walked toward the carriage. He stopped. He turned back. He didn't look at Ethan. He looked at Iris. She was standing in the shadows behind the well, a gray cloak, her hood pulled down, her face uncovered. The Count and Iris looked at each other. For 2 seconds, 3. The Count nodded to her almost imperceptibly, as if to an acquaintance, an accomplice, or someone from whom he expected certain actions. Iris turned pale. Her hand trembled. The cup she was holding slipped from her grasp and shattered on the stones. The sound echoed through the silence of the courtyard like a gunshot. Ethan turned at the sound. He looked at Iris. He looked at the Count. He looked at the shards of the cup. Mabel was looking at Iris too, but the expression on Mabel's face was different. Not suspicion. Horror. The horror of recognition. Mabel looked at Iris as if she were seeing a ghost. Her lips moved. A whisper. 2 words. It can't be. The Count got into the carriage. The door closed. The carriage drove away. The dust settled. Silence. Ethan stood in the middle of the courtyard and looked at the 2 women. At Iris, who stood over the broken cup, her face pale. At Mabel, who was clinging to the doorframe as if her legs wouldn't hold her. Ethan walked over to Mabel. He asked quietly what she had seen. Mabel looked at Iris. Her hands were shaking. Her voice cracked. She said it was the eyes. Iris had her son's eyes. The same color, the same shape, the same look she'd seen 20 years ago when they took him away. Iris heard her. She turned toward Mabel. Their eyes met. Mabel took a step forward. Iris stepped back. Mabel took another step. She asked for one word. Torin. Iris froze. Then she closed her eyes. Then she opened them, and she nodded, quietly, barely noticeably. Mabel clutched her heart. Reed caught her. Ethan stood nearby, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that were finally falling into place. Iris wasn't just any nun. She was an inquisitor of the Order of the Ashen Seal. The Order had taken Mabel's son, Torin, 20 years ago. Iris knew Torin. She had been his student or subordinate or something else. She had been sent here to watch or to kill. The Count knew. He nodded to her. So the Count was connected to the order, or knew about it. Ethan looked at Iris. He asked her directly, had she been sent to kill him? Iris was silent for a long time. Then she said yes, she had been sent. Ethan asked why she hadn't killed him. Iris looked at Mabel, whom Reed had seated on a bench, at Clara, who was bringing the old woman water, at Sun Min, who was standing in the doorway of the smithy with a hammer in her hands, ready to strike, at Lyra, who was clenching her quill so tightly it broke, at Jay, who was sitting on the roof and, for the first time in her life, wasn't smiling. Iris said it was because people lived here. Ethan nodded. He asked if Torin was alive. Iris said he was. He's the Order's chief inquisitor. He sent her here. Mabel heard that. She raised her head. Her boy was alive. For 20 years she'd thought he was dead. But he was alive. And he had sent an assassin after the man who had saved her mother's life. Mabel covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. But she wasn't crying. She was laughing. A quiet, hoarse, terrifying laugh. Ethan sat down next to her and put his arms around her shoulders. Mabel clung to his shirt. Ethan turned to Iris. He told her she had a choice, to go to the Order and report what she'd seen, or to stay and tell everything she knew. Iris stood motionless. The wind ruffled the hem of her gray cloak. She looked at Mabel, at a woman who could have been her grandmother if life had turned out differently. Then Iris removed the chain from her neck. A small token hung from it, silver, shaped like a seal, the insignia of an inquisitor of the Order of the Ash Seal. She held it in her hand. Then she turned and walked toward the forge. She pushed Sun Min aside. She opened the furnace door. She threw the seal into the fire. The silver sizzled. It darkened. It melted. It vanished. Iris turned around. Lines in the air. Resident Iris. Trust 0 out of 100. Number 47 out of 100. From 0 to 47. In a single action. 30 days. The Count gave him 30 days. Ethan gathered everyone around the communal table that evening. 32 people. Plus Iris, who sat on the edge of the bench and remained silent. Plus 5 new people who had arrived over the past week after hearing about the miracle on the barren land. 38 souls. Ethan stood up. He told them everything. About the Count. About the threat. About the army that would arrive in 30 days. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't soften it. He said the Count was a 5-star general, that he had at least 200 soldiers, that Heartwood had no walls and no army, that anyone who wanted to leave could leave right now. No hard feelings, no questions. Silence. Long. Heavy. Then Reed stood up. He said he was a former soldier and that the army had discharged him, that his family had disowned him, that for 2 months he'd been wandering, not knowing why he woke up in the morning. Then he came here, and for the first time in 2 years, he knew why he got up at dawn. He sat down. Sun Min stood up. Everyone froze. She never spoke in front of everyone. She looked at Ethan, then at her hands. She said 3 words. "I'm staying." She sat back down. Mabel stood up. She said she was 68 years old and too old to run, and that if anyone wanted to take her kitchen, they'd have to step over her dead body first. Clara stood up. She said this was her oven, her bread, and her home. She said she wasn't going anywhere. Gareth stood up. He looked at Nora, at her belly. Nora nodded. Gareth said they were staying. Jay didn't stand up. She shouted from the roof that she wasn't going anywhere anyway, and that someone should steal the Count's wallet when he arrived. A few people laughed. The tension eased slightly. Ethan scanned the table. Not a single person stood up to leave. Not a single one. He nodded. He said they had 30 days then, and he began to speak, quickly, clearly. The plan. First, walls, not stone ones. There's no time for stone ones. An earthen rampart with a wooden palisade. Gareth and Thomas are in charge. Everyone who can hold a shovel digs. Second, Weapons. Sun Ming forges spearheads. Simple. Effective. A peasant with a spear behind a palisade stands against a soldier in an open field. Third. Traps. Ethan remembered from history. Vietnamese peasants stopped armies with pits filled with stakes. A simple, cheap solution. He'll show them how. Fourth. Politics. That was the most important thing. Ethan turned to Lyra. He said he needed letters. 3 letters. The first to the royal inspector, stating that Count Valancourt was threatening to seize by force land that had just been surveyed and had paid 10 times the required tax. The second to Baron Hartwood, his father, stating that Ethan knew about the collusion with the Count and that a copy of the correspondence was on file with the notary in Brackenmere. The third to the neighboring barons, offering a trade. Grain at below-market prices in exchange for neutrality. Lyra listened. She took notes. Her face was calm, focused. She was writing letters that were undermining her own father's plans, and her hand did not tremble. Fifth, Iris. Ethan looked at her. He asked what she knew about the Count's plans. Iris paused. Then she began to speak. The Order of the Ashen Seal wants Hartwood's land not for the harvest. The second fragment of the core is sealed underground. 500 years ago, the Order cursed the land so that no one would dig, so that no one would find what lies beneath. The Count knows this. The Order is using the Count. The Count thinks he's using the Order. Both are mistaken. Ethan listened. He nodded. He was mapping it all out in his head. The Count wanted the land. The Order wanted the fragment. If he gave up one, he could keep the other. But Ethan wasn't going to give up either. The next day, work began. The rampart grew before their eyes. 38 men dug day and night. The palisade rose log by log. Sun Min hammered without stopping. No spearheads, gate bolts, staples for the palisade. Her hammer clanged from dawn to dusk, and after dusk by the light of the forge. Jay disappeared for 3 days. She returned with information. The Count is gathering mercenaries in Crosshaven. 40 men, not 200, 40. It was fewer than Ethan had feared. But 40 trained mercenaries against 38 peasants with spears, it would still be a bloodbath. If they played by the rules. Ethan had no intention of playing by the rules. He intended to play by the rules of an agronomist from Iowa, who had spent 7 years saving farms not with his fists, but with documents and numbers. The letters were sent. To the royal inspector, to his father, to the neighboring barons. Replies began to arrive on the 10th day. Baron Craig from the neighboring province accepted the trade proposal. Hartwood grain in exchange for neutrality. He signed the agreement. Baron Meredith in the east agreed as well. His lands were starving. Hartwood grain was more essential to him than friendship with Valancourt. 2 of the 4 neighboring barons sided with Ethan, not out of love for him, out of hunger and self-interest, but they sided with him nonetheless. The royal inspector sent a reply on the 20th day, an official document bearing a seal. Hartwood's lands are under the protection of the Crown until the completion of an investigation into the complaint regarding the threat of force. Any military action on Hartwood territory will be considered an act of rebellion against the Crown. Ethan read the document. He reread it. Then he showed it to Lyra. Lyra read it. She looked up. For the first time ever, she smiled. Not a subtle aristocratic smile, a broad one, a genuine one. She said her father would be furious. Ethan said he knew. Lyra was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly that she had no regrets. The lines. Resident, Lyra. Trust, 29 out of 100. Number 52 out of 100. At 50, Lyra pulled a rolled-up piece of paper from her pocket. She handed it to Ethan. An engagement contract with the heir to the Crossway house, signed by her father. She tore it in half, then in half again, and again. She tossed the scraps into the fire. She watched the paper burn. She turned to Ethan. She said she definitely had no regrets now. On the 30th day, the last day, dust on the road. But not 40 mercenaries, just one rider, A messenger from Count Valancourt, with a letter. Ethan broke the seal. He read it. The Count was recalling the mercenaries. The royal defenses made a direct attack impossible. The two barons on Ethan's side made a siege pointless. The Count wrote that he was retreating, for now, but not forever, and that Ethan had made a mistake by turning against a man who knows how to wait. Ethan folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. He looked at Mabel, at Sun Min, at Clara, at Lyra, at Reed, at Jay, at Iris, at all 38 of them. He said quietly, "We held out." Mabel burst into tears, uncontrollably, loudly, the way she hadn't cried in 20 years. Clara hugged her. Sun Min stood to the side, staring at her hammer. Then she raised it with one hand and struck the anvil. Once. The ringing echoed throughout Heartwood, like a bell. Reed stood at attention. He saluted, with his one hand, like a soldier. Jay yelled from the roof that they'd shown that Count a thing or two, and that she was going to steal his wallet after all. Someday, ever. A year had passed. Heartwood stood on land that had once been dead and breathed, truly breathed. 500 souls, not 38, 500. Huts had given way to houses. The palisade had been replaced by a stone wall. One street had become 5. Sun Min's blacksmith shop had expanded into a workshop with 3 forges and 2 apprentices. Clara's bakery stood in the center of the village, and merchants from 3 provinces bought bread there. A windmill spun on the hill beyond the eastern gate. A water wheel clattered in the stream, driving a hammer that Sun Min had designed herself. The irrigation canal had been widened, 3 new wells, 10 acres of wheat, 5 acres of barley, 2 acres of vegetables. Orchards with apple trees that Ethan had planted in the first month and that would bear fruit in 2 years. A school where Mabel taught the children to read and count. An infirmary where the herbalist Alden treated colds and cuts. A 30-man militia under Reed's command. Not an army, but enough to fend off bandits and give pause to anyone who might want to test Heartwood's resilience. Lyra sat in her office poring over the ledgers. She was no longer the daughter of the Earl of Valancourt. She had become Heartwood's chief treasurer. The 3 stars of precise calculation kept the village's economy in perfect order. Every coin accounted for, every sack of grain recorded, every transaction verified. She found a mention of the 0 soul in the old Valancourt scrolls. She brought it to Ethan. Ethan read it and put it away in a chest. Not yet. Not yet. Iris lived openly in Heartwood. She had discarded her gray cloak. She wore ordinary clothes. She helped Mabel at school. She taught the children to read and write. The 5 stars and her talent, the seal, were hidden behind the ordinary life of an ordinary woman who, for the first time in her life, felt that she belonged to a place rather than to an order. Her trust had reached 60. She told Ethan everything she knew about the Order of the Ashen Seal, about the fragments of the core, about the 0 King, sealed underground 500 years ago, about the fact that Ethan was the 4th outsider whose core had called him, and the first to survive. Mabel wrote a letter to her son, Torin, the Order's first inquisitor. A short one, 3 lines, saying that she was alive, that she knew who he was, and that Heartwood's doors were open if he decided to come. There was no reply. Yet. Jay had grown 2 inches and become the head of the Children's Patrol, a network of 12 boys and girls who ran through the 3 provinces and brought news faster than any messenger. She was still stealing spoons. Mabel still yelled at her. It had become a ritual, a tradition, a part of life. One evening, Ethan called her name across the yard. "Jay, dinner!" She was standing behind the barn. She thought he couldn't see her, but Ethan could. She was crying, quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. A minute later, she came out as if nothing had happened, with a smirk, with a stolen apple. Ethan pretended not to notice. Clara's father turned out not to be a miller. He was a former royal baker. He was hiding from the crown because he knew the recipe for true bread and ancient ritual bread. He told Ethan everything in a single evening, quietly, behind closed doors. Ethan listened. He nodded. He put the recipe away in that same chest. Not yet. Not yet. Count Valancourt remained silent. He waited, just as he'd promised, but his province was starving, and Heartwood was the only place within a 100-mile radius where the land yielded a harvest. Sooner or later, the Count would have to ask for it rather than take it. Ethan knew this, and he waited too. On the 365th day, exactly 1 year later, Ethan stood on a hill above Heartwood. The sunset painted the rooftops gold. 500 lights came on in the windows, one after another. The air smelled of Clara's bread, the smoke from Sun Min's blacksmith shop, fresh earth from the fields. A hammer was pounding. The mill was turning. Children were running down the street. Someone was laughing. Someone was calling out a name. Mabel called out from the porch of her new house, "Ethan!" Dinner. He stood there listening. Lyra quietly approached him. She sat down on the grass. She placed the ledger on her lap. She didn't open it. She just sat there. She was silent. Then she quietly said that her father had written to her, for the first time in 6 months. He asked if she wanted to come home. Ethan asked what she'd replied. Lyra paused. She said she'd written just one line, that she was already home. Ethan looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the village, at the 500 lights, at the life they'd built, out of mud and compost and clover and stubbornness. Ethan turned toward the village. His village. No, their village. His system was still 87% broken. He was still 0 stars. Outside Heartwood, he was still a nobody. Weaker than any guard, frailer than any farmer. Empty. But here, on this land, among these people, he was everything. Sun Min was coming up the hillside. Her hands were black. Her apron was covered in soot. She was carrying something wrapped in cloth. She approached. She held it out to Ethan. He unwrapped it. A sign, made of iron, hand-forged. The letters chiseled out with a chisel, rough but legible. Heartwood, founded in year 0. Ethan held the sign in his hands and couldn't speak. Sun Min stood before him and waited. He looked up. She was smiling, truly, broadly, openly, for the first time in his entire life. Ethan wanted to say something. He couldn't. He nodded. Sun Min nodded back. She turned around. She walked back toward the blacksmith shop. Halfway there, she stopped. She turned around. She said quietly that the plow had turned out beautifully. That first one. Ethan laughed. His voice cracked. He laughed even harder. Jay hung upside down from a tree branch and asked what he was laughing at. Mabel shouted again that dinner was getting cold. Reed walked by on his rounds and tipped his hat. Clara ran out of the bakery with a tray and called out that the pie was ready. Iris was sitting on the school porch, reading aloud to the children. Her voice was warm, not cold, warm. Finn ran past with a wooden sword. Nora ran after him, carrying her 1-year-old son in her arms, and shouted at him not to run so fast. Gareth was repairing the roof and whistling. Thomas was handing him nails. Alden was sitting on a bench feeding the pigeons. Ethan watched it all and thought. In his past life, he'd been driving home at night from a permaculture conference. He fell asleep at the wheel. He crashed into a tanker truck. The last thing he thought about was Clover. About that Clover thing he hadn't had time to show his father. And now here he was, standing on a hill in another world, with 0 stars, with a sign in his hands, with 500 people who call this place home. And the clover he planted first, that very clover. It's still growing, in the field below, green, bright, alive. Ethan stuck the sign into the ground at the top of the hill. Heartwood, founded by 0. He stood up straight. He looked at the sunset. He spoke quietly, addressing neither Mabel nor Lyra nor the system. Addressing his father from a past life. The old farmer from Iowa who taught him that the earth doesn't lie. He said, "Dad, I showed you the thing with the clover. It works." A breeze swept across the hill, warm, smelling of bread and earth and iron and life. And deep underground, in that very well Ethan had dug during his first week, something stirred. And a voice, that very voice, old and weary, like Ethan's own voice, only 500 years older. It whispered from the depths, "Hello, brother. It's been a long walk." Ethan heard it. He looked down at his feet, then at his hands, then at the sign, then at the village below. He nodded. He said quietly, "I'm here." And he walked down, toward dinner, toward Mabel, toward his people, toward his home.